How can $300 million in diamonds and an original Picasso painting vanish from a state-of-the-art airplane at 33,000 feet without leaving a single trace? It is a question that sounds like the setup for a heist movie, but for the people on the coast of Nova Scotia. It was the beginning of a tragedy that would take 4 years to fully understand. Tonight, we are looking into the moments where the world as we know it simply stops making sense. These are true stories about the vanishing point, where everything we trust can be erased in a matter of minutes. This episode is designed to pair with the rain you hear in the background to help you relax and slowly drift off. If you find these stories as haunting as I do, I would love for you to subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It is good to have you here by the fire while the storm rolls in outside. Before we get into the details, you might want to double check that your front door is actually locked. It is probably fine, but just like that like button, sometimes the things we think are settled have a way of shifting when we are not looking. Keep yourself safe and let us get into the first story. It starts on a clear night in 1998 when a luxury jet was cruising over the Atlantic, carrying a cargo that was worth more than most small cities. Captain Urs Zimmerman adjusted his seat in the cockpit of the McDonnell Douglas MD-11. He was a man of absolute precision, a former fighter pilot with over 10,000 hours in the air. Beside him sat First Officer Stephen Lowe, a younger but equally capable flyer who was known for his calm under pressure. They were both in high spirits as they prepared for Swissair Flight 111, a route they had flown dozens of times without a single issue. The flight was often called the United Nations Shuttle because it was a favorite for diplomats, scientists, and wealthy travelers moving between New York and Geneva. The cabin was a picture of late-night luxury filled with people who expected the best and usually received it. Among the 215 passengers were billionaire royalty, renowned researchers, and even the son of a famous painter. They were tucked into their plush seats, sipping wine and reading. In the belly of the plane sat a cargo that was tucked away in a high-security container. There was a 2-kilogram diamond, nearly 5 kilograms of other precious jewelry, and an original Picasso titled Le Peintre. It was a routine trip across the Atlantic, the kind of journey that had become a mundane miracle of the modern age. The plane pushed back from the gate at John F. Kennedy International Airport just after 8 in the evening, disappearing into the dark sky. First Officer Lowe handled the takeoff with practiced ease, the lights of Manhattan falling away beneath them. They were replaced by the dark, shimmering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a vast void that looked like a mirror of the night sky. The weather was perfect, the air still and clear. In the cockpit, the two pilots chatted about their upcoming schedules and the fine weather they expected in Switzerland. The hum of the 3 massive engines was a steady, reassuring pulse. They reached their cruising altitude of 33,000 feet within 20 minutes. To the passengers in the back, the world felt entirely still. They were insulated by layers of high-tech materials and the professional silence of the crew. Some were already asleep under heavy blankets, while others watched movies on the new in-flight entertainment system. It was one of the most advanced systems in the world, a point of pride for the airline and a symbol of their commitment to luxury. Hidden behind the ceiling panels, a tiny electrical arc had just jumped between 2 wires. The spark was smaller than a fingernail, but it found a ready fuel source in the thermal acoustic insulation blankets. These blankets were made of a material called metallized polyethylene terephthalate, designed to keep the cabin quiet and warm. It was a material that had passed all the safety tests of the era, but it was secretly highly flammable under the right conditions. The small spark caught the edge of the insulation, and a thin blue flame began to crawl across the top of the material. It was shielded from view by the heavy structural frames of the aircraft, moving in a space where no sensors had been installed. The fire didn't produce a massive cloud of smoke at first. It was a slow, concentrated burn that stayed in the dark space above the cockpit and the front galley, feeding on the oxygen-rich environment behind the walls. Zimmerman and Lowe were discussing their descent into Geneva, which was still hours away. They had no reason to look at the ceiling. The passengers were settling in for the long haul. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue glow. The silence was absolute, the kind of deep peace that only exists at 30,000 feet. It was a moment where everything felt exactly as it should be, a routine success of engineering and human planning in the middle of the dark. The first sign that something was wrong arrived at 9 to 10 in the evening. A faint, acrid scent drifted into the cockpit so thin it was almost like a memory. Lowe sniffed the air and looked over at Zimmerman, asking if he smelled something strange. The captain nodded, thinking it might be a temporary issue with the air conditioning system. They checked their gauges, but every needle was exactly where it belonged. The plane was still flying perfectly on its autopilot. They decided to investigate the galley to see if one of the ovens was overheating. Lowe stood up and checked the kitchen area, but the equipment was all cool to the touch. He spoke with the flight attendants, who hadn't noticed any unusual smells in the main cabin. By the time he sat back down in his seat, the smell had vanished entirely. It was a brief release of tension. They assumed it was a fluke, a small mechanical hiccup that had resolved itself in the wind. 3 minutes later, the smell came back, but this time it brought a visible haze. A wisp of gray smoke curled out from the air conditioning vents near the ceiling, hanging in the air like a ghost. The pilots realized this wasn't an appliance. Zimmerman took the controls, and Lowe reached for his radio. They called Moncton Area Control and declared a pan-pan. This is the signal for an urgent situation that is not yet a full emergency, a professional way of asking for priority. The air traffic controller in Canada heard the calm voice of Lowe and suggested they head for Halifax, which was the closest major airport. It was only about 70 miles away, a short distance for a jet of this size. The pilots agreed and began the turn toward the coast of Nova Scotia. They were not panicking because the plane was still responding to every movement of the yoke. To a pilot, if the controls work and the engines are running, the problem is still solvable. They needed to dump fuel before they could land safely. The plane was too heavy with gas to touch down without risking a structural failure. Lowe began the checklist for a fuel jettison, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of a man who had practiced this hundreds of times in a simulator. As they turned back toward the ocean to empty the tanks, the situation shifted. A series of rapid-fire pops sounded behind the cockpit wall like small firecrackers going off. Then the digital displays on the dashboard began to flicker. One screen went black, then another, and then the primary flight display died entirely. Zimmerman shouted that he was losing his instruments, his voice rising for the first time. The autopilot disconnected with a sharp electronic chirp that sounded like a warning. The cockpit was suddenly plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic flashes of sparking wires that were melting behind the panels. Thick black smoke began to pour from the ceiling, choking the pilots and making it impossible to see. They put on their oxygen masks, but the smoke was so dense it filled the space inside the goggles. Lowe tried to call Halifax back, but the radio was dead. They were flying a massive heavy jet at 300 miles per hour in total blindness. The fire had reached the main bus bars, the electrical spine of the plane, and was melting the very wires that sent instructions to the wings. 5 miles away, the residents of Peggy's Cove were winding down for the night. It was a quiet fishing village known for its white granite rocks and the lighthouse that stood guard over the Atlantic. A few fishermen were still at the docks, securing their boats for the night. They heard a low, heavy rumble that didn't sound like any engine they had heard before. It was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the water in the harbor and the glass in their windows. They looked up but saw nothing in the black sky until a massive shape blotted out the stars for a split second. The impact was not a slide or a splash. The aircraft struck the surface of the Atlantic at an almost vertical angle, traveling at nearly 350 miles per hour. At that speed, the water acts like a wall of solid concrete. The plane didn't sink so much as it disintegrated into millions of pieces. The force was so immense it registered as a small earthquake. The investigation that followed was the most expensive in Canadian history. For 4 years, divers and salvage crews worked in the freezing pitch-black water of the Atlantic. They recovered over 2 million fragments of the aircraft, a giant underwater jigsaw puzzle. Investigators had to painstakingly piece the wiring back together in a massive hangar looking for the tiny arc that had started it all. They found the fault in the power supply for the entertainment system. The fire had traveled along the ceiling, hidden and protected by the insulation, until it burned through the flight control cables. The pilots never had a chance to see the mountain of water they were flying into. The diamonds in the Picasso were never found in their original form. They had been pulverized by the impact, reduced to a fine shimmering dust that mixed with the sand on the seabed. To this day, the area around the crash is said to have a faint, unnatural glitter. Vic Gurdon, the lead investigator, spent years looking at the scorched remains of those insulation blankets. His team's work led to a global ban on the flammable material, a victory for safety that came at a staggering cost. The residents of Peggy's Cove still remember the night the ocean roared. They spent weeks helping the authorities their small fishing boats transformed into recovery vessels. They did it with a quiet dignity that has become part of the local history. As of 2026, the memorial at Peggy's Cove remains one of the most visited sites in Nova Scotia. It consists of two massive granite blocks that point toward the spot in the ocean where the plane went down. The cargo of jewels and art is officially considered lost to the sea, a permanent part of the North Atlantic sediment. Most of the wreckage has been moved to a storage facility, but the lessons learned from the fire are still taught to every new pilot today. Sometimes the thing that undoes a person isn't the danger itself. It's the moment right before, when everything still looked fine and the world was full of light. In our next case, the ground was just as final as the sea, but it wasn't made of diamonds. It was made of industrial concrete on the edge of a quiet city. A phone left on a kitchen counter. That is all it was. In the next case, it would be a secret hidden beneath the floorboards of a construction site. The humid Virginia night air felt like a wet blanket as Shari Hull pushed through the heavy steel exit door of the warehouse. It was just after 2 in the morning in mid-April of 1997. The industrial park on the edge of Richmond was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the interstate and the rhythmic clicking of her own heels on the cracked asphalt. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her breath visible in the dim glow of the lone security light that buzzed above the loading dock. Shari was 25 years old, and like most people her age in the city, she was defined by the rhythm of her responsibilities. She had 2 young children waiting for her at home, and the late shift job at the pet supply warehouse was the engine that kept their lives running. It was grueling work, hauling bags of kibble and managing inventory, but she did it with a quiet sort of pride. Her mind was already on the breakfast she would cook in a few hours and the soft weight of her kids as they woke up. The warehouse was a massive, windowless box that smelled of dry grain and cardboard. Shari had spent the last 8 hours navigating its narrow aisles, her world reduced to barcodes and shipping manifests. She was known for being the kind of person who never complained, the one who would stay 10 minutes late to help a coworker finish a pallet. That reliability was part of her nature, a steady pulse in a life that often felt like a series of deadlines and chores. She was a woman who lived for the small victories. Shari's world was small, but it was vibrant. Her apartment was filled with the clutter of a life lived for others, half-finished coloring books on the coffee table, a stack of bills pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sun, and the faint, sweet scent of the laundry. Detergent she used for the kids' clothes. She was the kind of mother who would work a double shift just to ensure there was a little extra for a birthday cake. That exhaustion was her constant companion, a heavy but familiar weight. She had a small group of friends who met on their rare days off, usually at a diner where the coffee was bottomless and the booths were worn thin. They talked about their dreams of moving closer to the coast or finding jobs that didn't require steel-toed boots. Shari always listened more than she spoke, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination. She didn't need much to be happy, just the knowledge that her circle was intact and the future was stable for her babies. Her daily rhythm was a series of small, cherished moments. The way the light hit the kitchen floor in the evening, the sound of her children's breathing as they slept, and the feeling of the heavy warehouse door closing behind her at the end of a shift. These were the anchors of her existence. She wasn't looking for adventure or danger, she was looking for a life that made sense. Every bag of kibble she moved was a step toward a home that was entirely her own, a sanctuary built on hard, honest work. The parking lot was a vast open space where the shadows seemed to stretch toward the tree line. Shari walked toward her car, her keys already threaded between her fingers as a habit of the late shift. She lived in a modest neighborhood where the neighbors knew each other's cars, and the security of that routine was something she took for granted. The industrial fringe of Richmond felt lonely at this hour, but it didn't feel threatening. It was just the empty space between her work and her real life. Her coworker was walking just a few paces behind her. She had spent the shift working near him, exchanging the usual pleasantries about the weather and the upcoming weekend. He was a man named Leslie, a fellow warehouse employee who seemed as unremarkable as the gray walls of the building. He was the kind of man who blended into the background of any room, a quiet presence that never drew attention to itself. He offered her a small, tired smile as they reached the edge of the row of cars. Sherry reached her vehicle and unlocked the door, the mechanical thud echoing in the stillness. She was thinking about the laundry that needed to be folded and the school project her oldest had mentioned earlier that week. The weight of her daily life was a comfort, a series of predictable problems that she knew how to solve. She didn't notice that Leslie hadn't gotten into his own car. He was standing by his open door, watching the tree line as if he were waiting for the wind to change. The industrial park was surrounded by active construction sites, places where new foundations were being poured for the expanding city. During the day, these sites were chaotic hives of noise and dust, but at night they became hollowed-out voids of red clay and rebar. Sherry drove past them every night, the skeletal structures of future buildings rising from the earth like ghosts. They were just part of the scenery, as invisible to her as the man standing in the deep shadows of the gravel lot. Safety is often just a lack of information. Sherry felt the familiar vibration of the engine as she turned the key. The radio hummed with a soft late-night jazz station. She had no reason to believe this night was any different from the hundreds that had come before. She put the car in gear, her eyes focusing on the exit gate. The routine was a shield, a promise that the world would continue to function in the way it always had. She began to pull forward, into the dark, thinking of home. A sharp, rhythmic tapping on her driver's side window made her foot jump to the brake. It was Leslie. He was standing there, his face partially obscured by the darkness pointing down toward her front tire. Sherry rolled the window down just an inch, the cool air rushing into the cabin. He looked concerned, his voice low and apologetic as he told her that it looked like she had a flat. It was a small, helpful gesture from a man she had worked beside for months, without incident. Sherry hesitated for a second, her hand still on the gear shift. She didn't want to deal with a flat tire at 2:30 in the morning, but she couldn't ignore it either. She looked at Leslie, who was already stepping back to give her room to get out and check. He looked tired just like her. He offered to take a look at it, his tone casual and neighborly. It was the kind of simple interaction that happens every day in the city, a brief moment of shared inconvenience between two tired colleagues. As soon as her boots hit the asphalt, the atmosphere in the parking lot seemed to change. The helpful concern on Leslie's face didn't vanish, but it shifted into something more focused and intense. He wasn't looking at the tire anymore. He was looking at her, and his hands were no longer at his sides. Before she could process the movement, the small talk died. The space between the cars felt suddenly claustrophobic, the security light above them flickering with a dying orange buzz. The transition from a routine conversation to a struggle was instantaneous and quiet. Shari's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird-like thudding that she could feel in her throat. There was no shouting, just the sound of scuffling feet and the heavy breathing of two people in the dark. The warehouse behind them was locked. The interstate was too far away for anyone to hear, and the parking lot had become a vacuum where her life was being pulled in a terrifying new direction. She found herself forced into the back of a vehicle, the interior smelling of old coffee and stale tobacco. The doors locked with a heavy final click that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into her spine. The man she had worked alongside for months was now a complete stranger, his movements efficient and cold. He didn't speak as he pulled out of the parking lot, heading away from the city and toward the darker, unlit roads that skirted the edge of the construction districts. They arrived at a place where the pavement ended and the red Virginia clay began. It was a construction site for a massive industrial complex, a sprawling field of deep pits and mounds of excavated earth. The air here was thick with the smell of wet dirt and diesel fuel. Leslie stopped the car near a deep trench that had been prepared for a concrete pour. He moved with the confidence of someone who had been here before, someone who understood the schedule of the heavy machines. Hours later, on the other side of that construction site, a different woman was fighting for her life. This woman had also been taken, also been left for dead in the mud. But as the sun began to cast a gray, cold light over the Richmond skyline, she found a reserve of strength that defied logic. She began to crawl. Her vision was blurred, her body was failing, but she dragged herself toward the road, her fingers digging into the wet clay until she finally reached the edge of the asphalt. A passing motorist saw the figure in the ditch, and stopped the screech of tires breaking the morning silence. The woman couldn't speak clearly, but she held on to the driver's hand with a grip that was terrifying in its intensity. She managed to whisper a name, Leslie. She told them where they had been, her words a jumble of construction pits and warehouse shifts. The police were called, and the quiet morning was suddenly shattered by the rising wail of sirens across the fringe. Detective Mark Thompson arrived at the scene as the first rays of sun hit the yellow tape. He listened to the survivor's account, his mind racing to connect the dots. They had a name and they had a location. But as he looked out over the vast landscape of the construction site, he realized the magnitude of the problem. There were dozens of pits, hundreds of mounds of dirt, and a fleet of cement trucks that were scheduled to arrive at any moment to begin the day's work. The noise of the industrial trucks was growing louder, a low-frequency thrum that Thompson could feel in the soles of his boots. He watched as the first of the massive mixers backed toward the gate, the driver waving to the foreman. They were on a strict union schedule, and every minute the police held them up cost the project thousands of dollars. The pressure from the site management was mounting, but Thompson refused to move. He stood on the edge of the red clay, scanning for a sign. The foreman of the construction crew met the police at the gate, his face pale as he realized what they were looking for. He explained that the pour was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp. Once the concrete was in the ground, it would set within hours, turning into a solid multi-ton block that would form the spine of the new building. If there was someone in one of those pits, they were running out of time before they were erased from the physical world by thousands of tons of stone. Every minute that passed felt like a physical weight on the investigators. They were moving through the red clay, checking the depth of the trenches and the stability of the walls. The air was cool, but Thompson was sweating under his jacket. He kept thinking about the 4-hour window. Industrial concrete is a chemical clock that doesn't care about justice or evidence. Once the reaction begins, it becomes a permanent part of the earth, a tomb that can never be opened again. Thompson reached the edge of a deep foundation pit near the northern edge of the site. He clicked on his heavy flashlight, even though the sun was up, to peer into the shadows of the trench. The beam of light cut through the gloom and hit something that made his heart stop. In the center of the pit, there was a patch of gray that looked different from the red clay. It was smooth, wet, and slightly shimmering. It was a fresh pour of cement that hadn't been there the day before. He scrambled down the slope, his boots sliding on the loose dirt. He reached the edge of the wet patch and realized it was a small, localized pour, as if someone had used a few bags of Quickset to cover something specific. He reached out and touched the surface. It was still soft, the consistency of thick mud, but it was already starting to resist. He called for the forensic team, his voice echoing in the hollow space. There was a shape beneath the surface, a subtle, human-shaped rise. The forensic team arrived with small hand tools and shovels, moving with a delicate urgency. They began to pull back the wet layers of cement, the gray sludge clinging to their gloves. It was a race against the chemistry of the material. As they cleared the top layer, a piece of dark fabric emerged. It was a heavy, durable material, the kind used for warehouse work. Thompson watched in silence as the smooth surface of the cement gave way to the reality of what had been hidden beneath. They worked through the morning, the sound of the nearby cement trucks idling at the gate, a constant reminder of the deadline. The gray stone was getting harder by the minute, requiring more force with every shovel full. They uncovered Shari Hull, her body perfectly preserved by the airless environment of the wet pour. She had been placed there with a cold, calculated precision, as if she were just another structural element to be built over and forgotten by the growing city. The survivor's testimony and the physical evidence in the pit provided a direct line to Leslie Birchfield. When the police arrived at his home, he was sitting in his kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking like the same unremarkable man Shari had shared a shift with just hours before. He didn't fight. He didn't even seem surprised. He had planned the erasure down to the minute, believing the city's expansion would do the work of hiding his secret for eternity. Birchfield had utilized his knowledge of the construction site's schedule to identify the perfect window. He knew which pits were being inspected and which were ready for the final pour. He had intended for Shari to be at the bottom of a foundation that would eventually support thousands of tons of machinery. He used a small amount of Quickset to pin her in place, planning for the massive industrial pour at 8 a.m. to finish the job. Only the survival of the second woman broke his logic. The crime was a study in industrial opportunism. He hadn't used a complex ritual or a hidden lair. he had used the public infrastructure of Richmond. He viewed the red clay and the wet stone as a permanent eraser, a way to make a human being cease to exist without leaving a single trace. The forensic team noted that if they had been just 2 hours later, the excavation would have required heavy jackhammers and the destruction of the building's primary support structure. Leslie Birchfield was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder. During the trial, he remained as quiet and impassive as he had been in the warehouse. There was no grand motive revealed, no hidden trauma that explained the violence. He was a man who saw a woman as a problem to be solved, and the earth as a place to dispose of it. His co-workers struggled to reconcile the helpful man they knew with the predator who had spent the night in the red mud. Shari Hull was finally laid to rest by her family, her name reclaimed from the gray silence of the construction site. Her children grew up knowing that their mother had been a woman of strength and reliability, not just a headline in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. The site where she was found is now a fully functional industrial area, a place where people work every day, unaware of the narrow margin that separated a solved mystery from a permanent, unmarked, and forgotten grave. As of 2026, Leslie Birchfield remains in a high-security prison in Virginia. He has exhausted his appeals, and the state has ensured that he will never again walk the industrial fringes of the city he tried to use as a cemetery. The construction site is finished, the buildings are old now, and the red clay is covered by miles of asphalt and steel. But for those who remember, that April morning the smell of wet cement will always carry a different, darker meaning. The urban fringe of Virginia is a place of hard angles and heavy machinery where the soil is turned over by men to build the future. But if you move across the map to the Great Rift Valley in Kenya, the terrain is softer, made of ancient sandstone that has been carved by time itself. In that valley, the ground doesn't need a man with a shovel to create a trap. It has been waiting for thousands of years to do it on its own. It was nearly 1 in the afternoon on a Sunday in 1997 when the first group of hikers reached the mouth of the Olnyaroa Gorge. The sun was a bright, heavy weight hanging over the Kenyan Rift Valley, turning the surrounding scrubland into a hazy blur of yellow and olive green. At the entrance of the canyon, the air was still and dry, carrying the faint, dusty scent of sun-baked minerals and wild sage. A group of 6 young people from a local youth group stood at the trailhead checking their water bottles and adjusting the straps of their lightweight backpacks. The red sandstone walls of the gorge rose up from the earth like the ribs of an ancient sleeping giant. These cliffs were hundreds of feet high, weathered by millennia of wind and rare violent rains into smooth curving shapes that looked almost liquid in the midday light. There was a profound sense of stillness at the bottom of the canyon, a geological silence that seemed to swallow the sounds of the nearby savanna. The ground beneath their boots was composed of fine rust-colored sand and smooth river stones that had been polished to a dull shine by water that hadn't flowed here in months. Among the group was a 19-year-old named Peter, who was acting as an informal leader for his friends. Peter was the kind of person who always had a map folded neatly in his back pocket and a spare flashlight tucked into his kit. He had grown up hearing stories about the beauty of Hell's Gate National Park, and he had been planning this trip for weeks. He worked part-time at a small grocery store in the city, saving his shillings to afford the bus fare and the park entrance fees. For him, this hike was more than just a Sunday outing. It was a rare chance to breathe air that didn't smell like diesel fumes. The youth group was a tight-knit circle of friends who had known each other since childhood. They shared a history of Sunday school lessons, soccer games in dusty lots, and the quiet, persistent pressures of trying to build a future in a rapidly changing world. One of the girls, Sarah, was a gifted student who had recently been accepted into a nursing program, and the group had spent much of the bus ride celebrating her success. They were young, full of energy, and possessed that specific kind of invincibility that comes with a clear sky and a well-marked trail. As they began their descent into the lower gorge, the world narrowed significantly. The walls of the canyon started to lean inward, blocking out the vast horizon of the Rift Valley and replacing it with a sliver of brilliant blue sky far overhead. The temperature dropped by several degrees as they moved into the shadows, the air becoming cool and slightly damp. Peter led the way, his boots making a rhythmic crunching sound on the gravel. He pointed out the strange rock formations and the tiny patches of green moss that clung to the crevices where the sun never reached. The Olnyaroa Gorge is a place of haunting beauty, so cinematic that it famously inspired the backdrops for animated legends. To the hikers, it felt like walking through a cathedral made of stone. They passed steam vents where volcanic heat hissed softly from the earth, sending white plumes of sulfur-scented vapor into the air. Sarah laughed as she tried to catch the steam in her hands, her voice echoing off the high curving walls. The group moved slowly, stopping to take photos and marvel at the way the light played across the deep ochre-colored ridges of the sandstone. They were deep within a section known as the lower gorge, where the path becomes so narrow in places that a person can touch both walls at once. This area was a labyrinth of tight corridors and sudden wide chambers that the locals called cauldrons. The ground here was uneven, requiring them to scramble over large boulders and navigate around deep, dry potholes. Peter kept a close eye on the group, making sure everyone was keeping pace. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for his friends, a weight that he carried with a quiet, practiced ease throughout the afternoon. The guide who accompanied them was an experienced man who had walked these paths hundreds of times. He spoke in a low, rhythmic voice about the history of the rocks, explaining how the Great Rift Valley had been torn open by the shifting of the tectonic plates. He told them that the park was called Hell's Gate because of the intense geothermal activity beneath their feet, but today it felt like anything but a place of fire. The gorge was a sanctuary of shade and cool stone, a hidden world that felt entirely disconnected from the harsh, burning sun of the plateau above. For hours, the hike was a perfect, uneventful progression through the heart of the canyon. They shared pieces of fruit and passed around a single bottle of lukewarm soda, their conversation drifting from school and family to the distant dreams they all harbored. There was no cell phone service at the bottom of the gorge, no radio updates, and no way to see the horizon. They were insulated by the rock, wrapped in a peaceful vertical landscape that felt as solid and eternal as anything they had ever known. The rhythm of their footsteps was the only clock that mattered. The guide mentioned that they were approaching the halfway point of the lower trek. He checked his watch and noted that they were making good time, which would allow them to reach the exit before the evening shadows made the footing too treacherous. Sarah was trailing slightly behind her fingers, tracing the patterns of the erosion on the walls. She was fascinated by the way the water had carved such intricate, swirling designs into the stone over millions of years. It was impossible to look at those deep grooves and not feel a sense of smallness in the face of geological time. Peter paused to wait for Sarah, leaning his back against a smooth, cool section of the canyon wall. He could feel the solid weight of the mountain behind him, a comforting, unmoving presence. He took a long drink of water, the liquid feeling cold and sharp in his dry throat. He looked up at the thin ribbon of blue sky and noticed that it seemed a bit paler than it had an hour ago, but there were no clouds visible from their vantage point. It was just a quiet, late afternoon sky over a peaceful, sun-drenched corner of the world. The first offbeat detail didn't come from the sky or the air. It came from the ground. Peter noticed a small, dark line of moisture beginning to creep across the dry sand near his boots. It looked like a spilled bottle of water, a thin, shimmering finger of liquid that snaked its way around the river stones. He frowned and pointed it out to the guide, who had also stopped to look. The guide crouched down, touching the wet sand with his fingertips. He looked puzzled, as if he were trying to solve a riddle that the ground was whispering to him in a language he didn't quite understand. Within seconds, the thin line of water became a shallow moving sheet that covered the entire width of the canyon floor. It was only an inch deep, but it was moving with a strange, purposeful speed. The water was a muddy, opaque brown, carrying with it small twigs and bits of dry grass. Peter felt a sudden sharp prickle of unease on the back of his neck. His muscles tensed and his heart began to pick up speed, a light thumping rhythm against his ribs. The air, which had been so still, was suddenly filled with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the rock itself. The hum grew into a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the soles of Peter's boots and into the bones of his legs. It sounded like 1,000 stampeding buffalo were rushing through the stone corridors just out of sight. The guide's eyes went wide, and he immediately began to shout, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. He told them they had to climb, his hands gesturing frantically toward the sheer vertical walls. But there were no ledges here. The sandstone had been polished smooth by eons of water, leaving nothing but rounded surfaces and shallow, useless indentations. Pressure was rising at a terrifying rate. The shallow sheet of water was now at their ankles, and the force of it was enough to make Peter stumble. He grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her skin as he tried to steady her. The roar was deafening now, a physical weight of sound that made it impossible to think or speak. He looked back toward the bend in the canyon and saw a wall of brown water at least 10 feet high rounding the corner. It wasn't just water, it was a churning mass of mud boulders and uprooted acacia trees that were being used as battering rams. The discovery was instantaneous and brutal. This was a flash flood, a wall of energy triggered by a violent cloudburst 10 miles away on the high plateau. While the hikers had been enjoying the sunshine, a massive volume of rain had fallen into the drainage basin of the Rift Valley, and the Olnyarowa Gorge was the only pipe narrow enough to carry it. They were at the bottom of a geological drain pipe, and the faucet had just been turned on to full capacity. There was no time to run, no way to climb, and nowhere to hide from the oncoming impact. Peter felt a sudden cold weight slam into his chest as the leading edge of the flood hit the group. He was lifted off his feet as if he were made of paper, the water instantly pulling him into a violent, spinning darkness. He felt the grit of the mud in his eyes and the sharp, stinging pain of branches scraping against his face. He tried to reach out for Sarah, but she was gone, swallowed by the brown churning mass in a single heartbeat. The world had become a chaotic liquid nightmare, where up and down no longer existed. The investigation into what happened in the gorge began as soon as the waters receded, which happened as quickly as they had arrived. Park rangers who had been alerted by the sudden change in weather on the plateau rushed to the entrance of the canyon as the sun began to set. They found the lower gorge transformed into a wasteland of thick gray mud and tangled debris. The beautiful red-walled sanctuary was now a scene of utter devastation. The rangers had to use heavy ropes and rappelling gear to navigate the slippery mud-coated cliffs as they searched for the missing youth group. They found the first sign of the tragedy near one of the large cauldrons at the base of a dry waterfall. A single colorful backpack was wedged into a crevice, its straps torn and its contents spilled into the silt. The rangers moved with a somber, focused urgency, their flashlights cutting through the deepening shadows of the canyon. They knew the geography of this place, and they knew that the force of the water would have swept anything in its path toward the deepest, most confined sections of the lower gorge. It was a search for fragments of lives that had been interrupted in an instant. The search continued through the night and into the following morning. The rangers were joined by local volunteers and members of the police force, all of them working in a heavy, respectful silence. They found the bodies of 5 of the hikers and their guide trapped beneath piles of uprooted trees and heavy river stones. The force of the hydraulic pressure had been so immense that it had moved boulders weighing several tons. The victims were found miles from where they had first seen the water deposited by the flood, in the most remote crevices of the park. The twist in the narrative became clear as the meteorologists analyzed the data from that afternoon. There had been no rain in Naivasha. There had been no clouds over Hell's Gate. The invisible killer was a localized storm that had occurred over a very specific high-altitude catchment area miles to the north. The water had traveled underground and through dry stream beds, gathering momentum and debris until it reached the narrow bottleneck of the Olnyarowa Gorge. The hikers never had a chance because the threat was literally invisible to them until it was seconds away. The climax of the story centered on Peter, the one member of the group who was not found among the debris in the lower sections. For 48 hours, his family and the rangers feared the worst. But as the sun rose on the third day, a search team spotted a figure huddled on a tiny precarious ledge nearly 20 feet above the canyon floor. It was Peter. He was covered in dried mud, his clothes were in tatters, and he was shivering violently, but he was alive. He had managed to find a single stubborn tree root protruding from the rock. Peter had spent 2 nights in total darkness clinging to that root while the water roared just inches beneath his dangling feet. He had watched the flood surge and then slowly retreat, leaving him stranded in a vertical world of mud and silence. He described the sound of the water as a living thing, a hungry animal that had tried to pull him back into the depths. His hands were raw and bleeding from the effort of holding on, and his mind was a blur of exhaustion and grief. He was the sole witness to the moment the peace of the afternoon was shattered. The truth of the event was a lesson in the brutal physics of the Great Rift Valley. The hydraulic funnel is a natural phenomenon where a wide area of rainfall is compressed into a narrow space, multiplying its speed and power 100-fold. In the Olnyarowa Gorge, the water rose 10 feet in less than 30 seconds. This wasn't a rising tide, it was a physical impact, a solid wall of liquid earth moving at the speed of a highway vehicle. The hikers had been caught in a geological trap that had been perfectly set by a storm they couldn't see. The 1997 disaster remains the darkest chapter in the history of Hell's Gate. It changed the way the park is managed, leading to the installation of the escape ledges, heavy steel ladders and concrete platforms bolted into the rock at regular intervals throughout the lower gorge. These are permanent reminders of the lives lost that Sunday afternoon. The tragedy also resulted in the creation of a sophisticated weather monitoring system that tracks rainfall on the plateau, allowing rangers to close the canyon long before the first drop of water reaches the gorge. As of 2026, the lower gorge is strictly regulated. During the rainy season, the trails are closed to all visitors, a policy that was born directly from the 1997 flood. The youth group is remembered with a small plaque near the park entrance, a quiet tribute to the friends who went out for a hike and never came home. Peter, now in his late 40s, still lives in Kenya and is said to be a man of deep, quiet faith who never enters the mountains without first looking at the horizon for the smallest sign of a distant cloud. There is a specific kind of helplessness that comes when nature decides to turn a beautiful space into a death trap. But sometimes the danger isn't in the walls of a canyon. It's sitting right in front of you on a dinner plate, hidden in the savory steam of a neighborhood meal. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged hills of the Wakayama Prefecture on July 25, 1998. In the small, quiet suburb of Sonobe, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sweet, heavy humidity of a Japanese summer. A group of local housewives stood around several massive industrial pots, their faces flushed from the heat of the gas burners. They were laughing and chatting as they stirred a thick golden liquid with long wooden paddles, the rhythmic clacking of the wood against the metal sides of the pots, serving as the heartbeat of the evening. In the center of the neighborhood's main residential street, several large blue plastic tarps had been spread across the asphalt. These tarps were the foundation for the annual summer festival, a tradition that brought the residents of Sonobe together to celebrate the end of the school year and the peak of the harvest season. Families were beginning to emerge from their homes carrying folding chairs and small tables. The atmosphere was one of practiced suburban harmony. Everyone knew their role, from the men setting up the sound system to the children who were already running in circles. 10-year-old Hiroki was one of those children, his laughter echoing off the low eaves of the surrounding houses. He was wearing a traditional cotton robe, the fabric already damp with sweat, as he chased his younger sister through the maze of blue tarps. His mother watched him from the cooking station, a small smile playing on her lips. For her, this festival was the culmination of weeks of planning. In a neighborhood where social standing was measured by how well you contributed to the collective, the success of the communal meal was everything. The centerpiece of the festival was the curry. In Japan, this isn't just a meal, it's a comfort food that represents the bond of a community. The women had been working since early that morning, peeling dozens of potatoes and slicing pounds of onions until their eyes stung. They took turns stirring the pots, ensuring the consistency was perfect. It was a shared responsibility, a ritual that reinforced the trust they had in one another. To share a meal from the same pot was to declare that you were part of a single extended family. Among the women stirring the pots was a local insurance agent in her late 30s. She was a well-known figure in Sonobe, a woman who had a reputation for being both incredibly helpful and slightly abrasive. She moved with a brisk, efficient energy, her eyes constantly scanning the street as if she were checking an invisible ledger. While the other mothers talked about their children's grades, she focused on the logistics of the insurance policies she had sold to almost every person sitting on those blue tarps. She was an essential, if somewhat polarizing thread in the social fabric. As the sky turned a deep bruised purple, the first bowls of curry were served. The line was long but orderly, a testament to the quiet discipline of the neighborhood. People sat in small circles on the tarps, the steam from their bowls rising into the cooling night air. Hiroki sat with his family blowing on a spoonful of the hot savory sauce before taking a large bite. He declared it the best curry he had ever tasted. Around him, dozens of his neighbors were nodding in agreement, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of paper lanterns strung between the telephone poles. The social pressure in a suburb like Sonobe is a quiet, constant weight. It is the pressure to fit in, to contribute exactly as much as your neighbor, and to never cause a disturbance. This harmony is what made the festival feel so safe. You knew the person who cooked your food, you knew where they lived, and you knew their children. The idea that a threat could exist within this circle was not just frightening, it was practically unthinkable. The festival was a sanctuary where the outside world, with all its random dangers, was temporarily held at bay by the strength of the collective. For the first hour, the night was a perfect success. The local elders sat on their chairs, sipping tea and watching the younger generation take over the festivities. There was a sense of continuity, a feeling that this night was just one more link in a chain that stretched back for decades. The children were given small sparklers, their tiny trails of light dancing in the shadows. The insurance agent had finished her duties at the pots and was now walking among the families, nodding to clients and ensuring that everyone had been served. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the unwritten rules. The first offbeat detail occurred just after 8 in the evening. A middle-aged man sitting near the edge of the blue tarps suddenly set his bowl down and clutched his stomach. He didn't make a scene at first, thinking perhaps the heat had finally caught up to him. But within minutes he was doubled over his face, turning a waxy shade of gray in the lantern light. His wife reached out to him, her voice hushed with concern, asking if he was all right. He couldn't answer. He was focused entirely on a sudden sharp cramping that felt like a hot iron was being twisted inside his gut. Across the tarp, a 10-year-old girl began to cough. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a violent, productive sound that left her gasping for air. Her father stood up, looking around for help, but he found that the street was no longer a place of celebration. People were beginning to stand up in small, panicked groups. The low hum of conversation had been replaced by the sound of retching and the frantic cries of parents calling for their children. Hiroki felt a sudden cold wave of nausea wash over him, his vision blurring as the paper lanterns seemed to spin in the darkness. Pressure was rising as the local clinic was overwhelmed. Within 30 minutes, over 60 people were showing identical symptoms. They were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies racked by tremors and a burning sensation in their chests. The festive atmosphere had vanished, replaced by the clinical blue-white strobes of ambulances that were struggling to navigate the narrow suburban streets. The paramedics were confused. Food poisoning usually took hours to manifest, but these people were collapsing in real time sometimes while they still had the wooden spoons in their hands. The discovery came in the early hours of the morning at the local hospital. As doctors worked to stabilize the victims, they noticed a recurring physical sign. Several of the survivors had strange white bands appearing across their fingernails, and their skin was developing small dark lesions that looked like raindrops on a dusty road. These were the classic unmistakable hallmarks of acute arsenic poisoning. This wasn't a batch of bad meat or a hygiene issue. Someone had introduced a high-grade industrial toxin into the communal pots, turning the symbol of community trust into a mass casualty weapon. The investigation that followed was a slow, grinding process that peeled back the layers of Shinobi's suburban veneer. Detectives from the Wakayama police force moved through the neighborhood, interviewing every person who had been near the cooking station. They were looking for a motive, in a place where motives were supposed to be hidden behind polite smiles. They focused on the insurance agent Masumi Hayashi. Neighbors began to whisper about her history of insurance fraud and how she had allegedly used small doses of poison in the past to collect payouts. The community's protective shell was beginning to crack. The search of the Hayashi home revealed a hidden stash of white powder in the kitchen that was later confirmed to be arsenic. It matched the chemical signature of the poison found in the curry pots. But the investigation hit a wall when it came to the how and why. No one had actually seen her add the powder to the pots. There were no witnesses who could place the toxin in her hand at the cooking station. The case became a national obsession, with news crews camping out on the street, capturing the image of Hayashi spraying reporters with a garden hose in a fit of rage. The clue that changed everything was the specific forensic testing of the arsenic. Scientists used a highly advanced radiation analysis to compare the impurities in the arsenic found in the curry to the stash in Hayashi's home. They claimed the two samples were a molecular match. This was the smoking gun the prosecution needed. However, the defense argued that this type of testing was flawed and that the arsenic could have come from any number of industrial sources in the region. The neighborhood was now a battleground of theories, with the residents forced to choose sides in a drama they never wanted. The climax of the trial was a somber, high-stakes affair. Masumi Hayashi sat in the courtroom, her expression unreadable as the families of the 4 people who had died gave their testimony. Two of those victims were children who had just been starting their lives. The emotional weight in the room was suffocating. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven by a bizarre, cold-blooded desire for attention and power within her small social circle. Despite her consistent claims of innocence, the court relied on the forensic match and her history of fraud to reach a verdict. The truth of the method was a chilling reconstruction of suburban access. Because Hayashi was a trusted member of the neighborhood association, she had unrestricted access to the cooking area. While the other women were busy with the logistics of the festival, it would have taken only a few seconds to tip a small container of white powder into the steaming pots. The curry's strong, savory spices were the perfect mask for the bitter, metallic tang of the arsenic. It was a crime of opportunity that utilized the very trust that the festival was designed to celebrate. Masumi Hayashi was sentenced to death in 2002. The case left a permanent scar on the Japanese psyche, leading to a massive wave of food tampering scares across the country. In Sonobe, the summer festival was never the same. The blue tarps were put away for years, and the tradition of the communal pot was abandoned in favor of pre-packaged meals. The social fabric of the street had been torn apart not just by the poison, but by the realization that a monster could stir the same pot as a mother, without anyone noticing the difference. As of 2026, Masumi Hayashi remains on death row in a Japanese prison. Her son has spent the last 2 decades campaigning for her release, claiming that the forensic evidence used to convict her was scientifically invalid. In late 2024, the Japanese Supreme Court rejected her latest appeal for a retrial, meaning her sentence could be carried out at any time. The suburb of Sonobe has largely moved on, but the elders still look at the cooking stations with a lingering sense of unease, remembering the night the curry turned into a coffin. That was the summer of 1998. In that same year, on the other side of the world, 5 people were climbing into a vehicle for a trip that would lead them into a very different kind of silence. They weren't looking for a neighborhood festival. They were looking for a landscape of pure salt and light, unaware that the beauty of the horizon was just another form of a locked door. The white Toyota Land Cruiser rolled across the hexagonal salt crusts at 11 in the morning. It was late 1998, and the sun was a blinding silver coin hanging in a sky so blue it looked artificial. Inside the cab, the hum of the tires against the dry minerals was the only sound for miles. The driver, a local guide named Jorge, kept his hands steady on the wheel as the vehicle glided over the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. Outside the windows, the world had been reduced to 2 colors, brilliant white and deep azure. The Salar is a 4,000 square mile mirror of prehistoric salt, a place where the horizon line often disappears entirely. The air at 12,000 feet was thin and tasted like nothing. Jorge adjusted his sunglasses, feeling the dry heat radiate off the crystalline ground. There were no trees, no birds, and no landmarks to guide the eye. In the back seats, 5 travelers were quiet, lost in the sheer scale of the landscape. They were young, mostly in their 20s, coming from Europe and North America to see the mirror of the world. They had spent the last week traveling through the rugged highlands of the Andes, their backpacks filled with cameras, journals, and a few liters of water. For them, this was the ultimate adventure, a journey to a place that looked like the surface of another planet. One of the travelers, a young woman named Elena, was leaning her forehead against the glass. She was a teacher back home, someone who spent her winters dreaming of the wide-open spaces of South America. She had a thick journal in her lap, already half filled with sketches of llamas and the red mountains of the Altiplano. She was the one who kept the group organized, the one who carried the extra batteries and the maps that everyone else seemed to forget. Sitting next to her was Mark, a graduate student who had saved for 2 years to afford this trip. He was usually the first one to start a conversation, the one who cracked jokes when the bus rides got too long or the altitude made everyone's heads throb. But today, even Mark was silent. The Salar has a way of silencing people. It is a space so vast that human conversation feels small and unnecessary, like a whisper in a cathedral made of glass. Jorge had been driving these flats for a decade. He was a man of the high desert with skin the color of mahogany and a deep understanding of the thin air. He knew the Salar wasn't just a tourist destination. It was a lithium-rich void that could be as hostile as it was beautiful. He kept a small stash of coca leaves in his pocket to chew on a traditional way to ward off the fatigue and the headaches. He felt the vibration of the engine through his boots. The group had started the day at a small salt hotel on the edge of the flats. They had eaten a breakfast of hard rolls and strong coffee while watching the sun rise over the white expanse. It had been a morning of laughter and anticipation. They were heading for the center of the salar, toward a small island of cacti that sat like a green oasis in the middle of the desert. The plan was simple: drive in, take photos, and be back before the temperature dropped. The Salar de Uyuni is the remains of a prehistoric lake that dried up thousands of years ago. What remains is a crust of salt, several meters thick, covering a pool of brine that holds much of the world's lithium. It is perfectly flat, so flat that NASA uses it to calibrate satellites. To a driver like Jorge, the surface felt like a paved road, allowing him to maintain a steady speed of 40 miles per hour as they moved deeper into the white room. The glare off the ground was intense, a physical pressure that squeezed the eyes even behind dark lenses. Every now and then a mirage would shimmer on the horizon, making it look like there were mountains or lakes just a few miles away. But as they drove, the images would dissolve into more white crust. The silence outside was absolute. If the engine stopped, the only thing you would hear would be the blood rushing in your ears and the faint crack of the salt. The Land Cruiser was their lifeline. It carried their food, their spare clothing, and the fuel needed to cross the expanse. It was a sturdy machine built for the rough terrain of the Andes, and it had never failed Jorge before. He listened to the steady rhythm of the cylinders, a comforting mechanical heartbeat in a world that offered no other signs of life. The group felt the vibration through their seats, a constant reminder that they were moving toward their goal. They wanted to reach the Incahuasi Island by noon. It was a rocky outcropping covered in giant cacti, some of them hundreds of years old. From the top of the island you could see for 60 miles in every direction a view of pure, uninterrupted white. Elena had her camera ready, her finger resting on the shutter button. She wanted to capture the moment when the sky and the ground became one, a photograph that would prove she had stood at the edge of the world. Despite the beauty, there was a quiet pressure in the back of Jorge's mind. He knew the weather in the Altiplano could change in minutes. A sudden wind could kick up the salt dust, creating a whiteout that was just as dangerous as a blizzard. He also knew that his radio had been acting up since the morning the signal lost in the vastness of the flats. But the sky was clear and the ground was firm. There was no reason for a man like him to turn back now. The group was now singing softly to a cassette tape that Mark had brought along. The music was a thin, tinny sound in the cabin, but it helped to bridge the gap between their world and the alien landscape outside. They felt a sense of freedom that only comes from being truly disconnected. No phones, no schedules, no expectations. Just 6 people in a white box, moving through a space that seemed to exist outside of time. They were happy, and they were present. By 11:30, they were approaching the coordinates for the center of the salar. The island was still just a dark speck on the horizon, a tiny break in the infinite white. Jorge checked his fuel gauge and the engine temperature. Everything was normal. He took a deep breath of the thin, dry air and adjusted his grip on the wheel. He felt a sense of accomplishment. This was the part of the job he loved most, showing people the impossible scale of his home. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a map. He began tracing their route, pointing out the vast distances they had already covered. He was fascinated by the geography, by the idea that they were standing on a layer of salt that was millions of years old. He shared a few facts with Elena, his voice full of the wonder of a student seeing his textbooks come to life. She smiled and nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant island that was slowly growing larger. The light was becoming even more intense as the sun reached its zenith. It was a vertical light casting almost no shadows. The Land Cruiser looked like it was floating on a sea of white light. Jorge squinted, his eyes starting to ache from the constant strain of the glare. He knew that the white salt reflected almost all of the sun's radiation, including the harmful UV rays. He made sure everyone had their glasses on, a small but vital rule for surviving the salar. At exactly 11:45, the engine made a sound that Jorge had never heard before. It was a sharp, metallic cough, followed by a sudden loss of power. The Land Cruiser shuddered, and the needle on the speedometer began to drop. Jorge shifted gears, trying to keep the momentum going, but the engine sputtered one last time and then went silent. The vehicle coasted for a few hundred feet before coming to a complete stop in the center of the white void. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Without the hum of the engine, the cabin felt suddenly cold. Jorge turned the key again, the starter motor, making a thin, frantic whirring sound that echoed across the flats, but the engine wouldn't catch. He tried again and again, his brow furrowed in concentration. The travelers looked at each other, the laughter from moments ago replaced by a sudden sharp curiosity. They weren't afraid yet, they were just confused. Jorge stepped out of the vehicle, his boots making a loud crunch as they hit the salt crust. The heat hit him instantly, a dry baking heat that seemed to come from both above and below. He opened the hood, and a cloud of steam billowed out into the thin air. He checked the belts and the wires, his hands moving with a desperate efficiency. He realized that a critical hose had burst, and the coolant had drained out onto the white salt, leaving a dark stain. The island was still visible, but it was at least 15 miles away. In the thin air of 12,000 feet distances are deceptive. What looks like a short walk can take hours, and every movement requires twice the effort. The sun was now directly overhead, and the glare was becoming a physical force. Without the air conditioning of the vehicle, the interior of the Land Cruiser was rapidly heating up. The group stepped outside, standing in the shadow of the hood. Jorge reached for the radio, his thumb pressing the transmit button with a steady rhythmic pressure. He called for the hotel for the other guides, for anyone who might be listening. But the only response was the crackle of static, a hollow sound that seemed to mock their isolation. He knew that they were in the dead zone of the Salar, where the surrounding mountains blocked the signals and the vastness of the flats swallowed any attempt at communication. Mark looked around at the horizon. In every direction it was exactly the same. There were no tracks to follow as the wind and the salt crystals quickly erased the tire marks. Without the vehicle, they were just 6 small figures in a 4,000 square mile white room. He felt a sudden cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. He looked at Elena, who was holding her journal tightly against her chest. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep, focused concentration. 2 weeks later, a group of salt miners was moving through the center of the flats, looking for new deposits of lithium-rich brine. They saw a dark shape on the horizon, a speck that didn't belong in the white world. As they got closer, they recognized the white Toyota Land Cruiser. It was parked perfectly, as if it were waiting for someone to return. But the windows were covered in a thin layer of salt dust, and the tires were slightly deflated by the cycle of heat. The miners approached the vehicle with a sense of dread. They knew that no one would leave a car in the center of the Salar by choice. They peeked through the dusty windows and saw the interior was filled with backpacks, jackets, and empty water bottles. The journals were still on the seats, their pages fluttering in the light breeze, but the cabin was empty. There was no sign of Jorge or the 5 travelers. The vehicle sat like a ghost ship in a frozen sea. The Bolivian authorities were called, and a search team was dispatched to the center of the flats. They began to piece together the final hours of the group by examining the items left behind. They found Elena's journal, the last entry dated the day they disappeared. It described the engine failure and the initial decision to stay with the car. But as the pages continued, the handwriting became shaky and fragmented, reflecting the growing desperation of the group. On the backs of the maps and the scraps of paper found in the glove box, the travelers had written final letters to their families. They were letters of love and regret written in a variety of languages, but all carrying the same tone of quiet despair. They spoke of the cold at night, the blinding sun during the day, and the realization that no one was coming to save them. These documents became a haunting record of the psychological breakdown that occurs in total isolation. The search team noticed that the group had eventually made a fatal decision. Based on the tracks that hadn't been fully erased, it appeared that the group had split up. 3 of the travelers and Jorge had decided to walk toward the mountains to the north, believing they could reach a road. The other 2 had stayed with the vehicle, hoping for a rescue. In the Salar, splitting up is a death sentence. It divides the resources and leaves everyone more vulnerable. The investigators used GPS to track the probable routes. They realized that the mountains the group was walking toward were actually over 80 miles away. In the thin air and the blinding glare, the peaks looked like they were just a few hours' walk. This is a common phenomenon in the high Andes, known as the mirage trap. A person will walk for hours toward a landmark, only to find that it hasn't gotten any closer, leading to exhaustion and a total loss of orientation. The most unsettling discovery came from the forensic medical report on the items left in the car. They found several pairs of sunglasses that had been smashed or discarded. The investigators realized the group had been suffering from photokeratitis, also known as snow blindness. The white salt reflects nearly 100% of the UV radiation, which literally burns the surface of the cornea. Within 48 hours, the group would have been partially or totally blind. The search team found the first body nearly 20 miles from the vehicle. It was the lone walker, one of the young men who had tried to find help. He was lying face down in the salt, his arms stretched out as if he were still reaching for the horizon. When they turned him over, they realized he was pointing in the wrong direction entirely. He had been walking away from the road and deeper into the empty center of the salar. He had died of exposure in the white void. The nighttime temperature in the salar during the winter can drop to 20 below zero. Without a heat source, the human body begins to shut down within hours. The searchers found the remaining members of the group scattered across the flats, each of them miles apart. They had all died of hypothermia, their bodies frozen in the dry, thin air. They had been victims of an environment that was both a furnace by day and a freezer by night, leaving them no escape. The full reconstruction of the event showed a chain of consequences that started with a single burst hose. The mirror of the salar had created a psychological cage. The group was trapped not by walls but by their own senses. The blinding light had taken their sight, the deceptive distances had taken their strength, and the absolute silence had taken their hope. By the time they decided to walk, they were already physically and mentally broken by the salar's hostility. The Jeep of the Dead became a case study in expedition failure. The method of the environment was total erasure. It used the very beauty that drew the travelers in to destroy them. The salt flat is a landscape of extremes that leaves no room for error. A simple mechanical failure, something that would be a minor inconvenience in a city, became a terminal event in the heart of the lithium flats. The salar doesn't hunt, it simply waits for you to make a mistake. The only survivor of the event was the landscape itself. The Salar de Uyuni remains unchanged, a vast and indifferent mirror that continues to draw thousands of tourists every year. However, the tragedy of 1998 led to a permanent change in how the region is governed. The Bolivian government implemented a dual-vehicle mandate. No tour operator is allowed to enter the center of the flats without a second vehicle and a working satellite phone. As of 2026, the Salar has become a hub of global industry as the demand for lithium for electric batteries has skyrocketed. Huge mining operations now dot the edges of the flats, and the silence is often broken by the hum of heavy machinery. But in the very center, where the ground is still pure white and the sky is deep blue, the memory of the 1998 group remains. It is a prehistoric void that reminds us that total beauty can mean total isolation. They were trapped inside a vehicle that couldn't move, surrounded by miles of empty space. Our next case involves a container that was even smaller, but instead of being lost in the wide open, it was tucked away in a quiet room that had been locked from the inside for 20 years. A phone left on a kitchen counter, that's all it was. In the next case, it would be a note tucked inside the heavy iron frame of an old Victorian piano in the heart of a busy city. The air in the borough of Hackney always feels heavy, but in the summer of 1998, it was something else entirely. A crew of 4 movers stood at the threshold of a second-floor flat on a narrow residential street. The windows were caked in a thick layer of soot and dust, turning the midday sun into a dim, sickly yellow glow. They were there to clear out the remains of a life that had been quietly rotting away for decades within those walls. The landlord had finally decided to renovate the property after the last tenant moved out in a hurry, citing a persistent foul odor that no amount of bleach could kill. The flat was a classic London bedsitter, a single room where every necessity of a human life was squeezed into a space no larger than a shipping container. It smelled of damp wool, old newspapers, and a lingering metallic musk that seemed to stick to the back of the throat. The movers stepped over piles of yellowed magazines, their boots sinking into the rotting carpet with a soft, wet sound. In the center of the room sat a massive, upright Victorian piano. It was a beautiful piece of dark mahogany, though its finish was now clouded by years of neglect and wood smoke. It looked like a silent, heavy monument in the middle of a graveyard. The lead mover wiped his forehead, his hand coming away black with the grime of the room. To understand how a piano becomes a tomb, you have to understand the life of the person who once lived in a place like this, back in the late 1970s. Imagine a man who exists in the cracks of a city of millions. He is the person you see every day at the bus stop but never truly notice. He wears a heavy wool coat regardless of the season and carries a small bag of groceries that never seems to contain enough for a full meal. His world is defined by the four walls of this room. The ceiling is stained with watermarks that look like maps of countries that no longer exist. He wakes up to the sound of the neighbor's radio through the thin floorboards and falls asleep to the low, constant rumble of the city outside. His only real company is that piano. He doesn't play it for an audience. He plays it for the silence, the notes echoing off the damp wallpaper and dying in the corners. There is a specific kind of loneliness that settles into the bones in a London winter. The sky stays a flat, bruised gray for months on end, and the dampness finds its way through the gaps in the window frames. He spends his evenings sitting on a wooden stool, his fingers tracing the ivory keys. Some of the keys are chipped, and others don't make a sound at all, but to him the instrument is the only thing in the world that is truly his. He has a routine that never varies. He walks to the corner shop at exactly 4 p.m. to buy a single pint of milk and a newspaper. He nods to the shopkeeper, who nods back without ever learning his name. He is a ghost who hasn't realized he is dead yet. To the world outside, he is a non-entity, a ripple in the water that disappears as soon as it is made. He is the personification of the London bedsitter, isolated and utterly forgotten. Every month he slides an envelope containing his rent under the landlord's door down the hall. He never speaks to the man. The landlord is happy as long as the money is there, never once asking why the tenant doesn't have visitors or why his mail consists only of local advertisements. In a city where everyone is rushing towards something, he is perfectly stationary. He is a man who has successfully deleted himself from the narrative of his own life. The pressure of this kind of existence is a quiet, grinding force. It isn't a sudden explosion. It is the slow accumulation of days where no one speaks your name. He watches the people on the street from his second-floor window, a silent observer of a life he no longer participates in. He wonders if they would notice if he simply stopped moving. He looks at the piano, the dark wood reflecting the dim light of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. One evening, in the late 70s, the music in that flat stops. The silence that follows isn't heavy at first. The neighbors assume he finally moved out or perhaps just gave up on the hobby. The landlord finds the rent envelope missing 1 month, but he discovers a new tenant almost immediately, a man who doesn't mind the clutter and doesn't ask questions about the furniture left behind. The piano remains in the center of the room, a permanent fixture. For 20 years, a series of short-term tenants lived in that room. They slept in the same space, breathed the same damp air, and used the piano as a shelf for their books and lamps. They complained about the smell occasionally, but in an old building in Hackney, a musty odor is almost expected. It is the scent of age and decay that people just learn to live with. They never once thought to open the heavy mahogany casing of the instrument. As the movers in 1998 gripped the edges of the piano, they expected a struggle. These old Victorian models are made of solid cast iron and heavy hardwoods. But as they tried to heave it toward the door, the weight felt wrong. It wasn't just heavy, it was unbalanced, as if the center of gravity had shifted toward the back of the frame. One of the men slipped his hand, sliding across the bottom of the wood. When his hand came away, it was covered in a dark, viscous fluid that looked like old motor oil, but smelled sharply of copper and rotted fruit. He wiped it on his trousers, a look of sudden sharp disgust crossing his face. The fluid was leaking from a small crack in the bottom of the casing, a slow and steady drip that had begun as soon as the instrument was tilted. They set the piano back down with a heavy, echoing thud. The lead mover took a screwdriver from his belt and began to prise open the front panel of the piano. The wood groaned under the pressure, the old screws screaming as they were forced out of their holes. As the panel fell away, a wave of cold, stagnant air hit them. It was a smell so thick and ancient that it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Behind the strings and the hammers, there was something that did not belong. The discovery was a moment of absolute frozen horror. Tucked inside the iron frame, folded with the precision of origami, were the mummified remains of a man. He was wearing a heavy wool coat and thick trousers that were clearly from the 1970s. His body had been forced into the narrow space between the soundboard and the outer casing, his limbs bent at angles that defied the logic of a living human frame. His skin was the color of old parchment, pulled tight over a skull that seemed to be grinning at the men in the room. He had been there so long that he had effectively become part of the instrument. His hair had grown long and tangled in the piano wires, and his fingers were still curled as if he were trying to reach for a final note that had long since faded. The movers backed away, their breath coming in short, ragged gasps. You can feel the cold sweat breaking out on your forehead when you realize that for 20 years people had been sitting in this room, perhaps even resting their drinks on this very lid, while a human being was dissolving inside. The silence of the piano wasn't just a lack of music, it was the silence of a tomb. The physical reality of the space is a crushing weight. The walls feel like they are leaning in the dust in the air, suddenly tasting like the man inside the wood. The police arrived within 20 minutes, cordoning off the narrow street. Forensic investigators moved into the flat with the detached efficiency of people who deal in the macabre. They had to use specialized saws to cut through the mahogany, carefully extracting the remains from the iron harp of the piano. The process took hours, a grim surgery performed in a room that had seen far too much of the same scenery for far too long. The investigation into the Piano Man of Hackney was a journey into a dead end. There were no dental records that matched, no fingerprints on file, and the rent envelopes from the 70s had long since been destroyed. The landlord from that era had passed away years ago. The police looked through decades of missing persons reports, but they found a disturbing truth. No one had ever reported a man matching this description as missing. Forensic musicologists were called in to examine the instrument itself. They found that the internal workings of the piano had been intentionally altered. Several of the heavy iron strings had been cut or moved to create enough space for a body to fit inside the frame. This wasn't an accident where someone fell in and got stuck. This was a deliberate act of concealment that required both physical strength and a chilling level of technical knowledge. The clue that changed the nature of the case was found tucked deep within the coat pocket of the deceased. It was a small handwritten note on the back of a grocery receipt. The ink had faded to a ghostly blue, but the words were still legible. It was a simple list of names and dates, followed by a single sentence. They will never look inside the music. The dates spanned from 1975 to 1978. The climax of the mystery was the realization of the timeline. The last date on the list was just days before the man was believed to have vanished. The investigation shifted from a simple found body case to a search for a killer who had potentially lived in that very room. Did a murderer kill this man, hide him in the piano, and then continue to live there, perhaps even playing the keys while his victim sat inches away? The truth of the method is a study in structural horror. To fit a grown man into the casing of an upright piano, the body would have had to be placed there while it was still in the state of primary flaccidity immediately after death. The perpetrator would have had to disassemble the front of the instrument, move the heavy hammers, and then force the limbs into the gaps between the iron supports. It was a task that would have taken hours of focused, silent labor. The killer then simply put the panels back on, tightened the screws, and continued with their life. They knew that in a place like Hackney, people ignore the small, strange things. They knew that no one ever looks inside a piano unless it needs to be tuned, and this piano was so old that no one would bother. It was the perfect hiding place because it was a piece of furniture that is defined by the space it occupies. The identity of the Piano Man remains one of London's most unsettling cold cases. Some believe he was a squatter who was killed during a dispute, while others think he was a victim of a more calculated personal betrayal. The lack of a name is the final erasure. He was a man who lived as a ghost and died as one, his only legacy being the dark fluid that eventually betrayed his presence to a crew of movers. As of 2026, the case remains officially unsolved. Forensic teams have recently utilized advanced genetic genealogy, comparing the victim's DNA to international databases in the hopes of finding a distant relative. There are several potential matches currently being investigated across Europe, but for now, the man in the wool coat remains a John Doe. He is a reminder that you can be buried in the middle of a city and never be found. The apartment in Hackney has long since been renovated and sold. The new owners likely have no idea about the history of the floorboards they walk on. The piano itself was destroyed by the police. As part of the evidence recovery process, its mahogany and iron broken down into scrap. But the emotional residue of the case lingers in the neighborhood, a story told in low voices when the summer nights get too quiet. It is strange how a person can be hidden in the middle of a crowd for 20 years without a single person noticing. But there are other ways to be blinded, even when you are moving through the world with a purpose. Sometimes the environment itself creates a wall that no one can see through, turning a clear path into a terminal trap. That was the reality for a crew in Indonesia, where the air itself became a blindfold. On the other side of the world, in a place where the mountains are hidden by a thick orange haze, a different kind of silence was already waiting. It wasn't the silence of a locked room or a mahogany casing. It was the silence of a sky that had turned into a solid, impenetrable wall. The cockpit of the Airbus A300 was bathed in an unsettling, sulphurous orange glow. Captain Hans Ramenzia squinted through the windshield, his eyes burning from the fine gray ash that seemed to permeate even the pressurized air of the flight deck. It was late September in 1997, and the island of Sumatra had disappeared beneath a thick, toxic blanket of peat smoke known as the Great Haze. The horizon was gone, replaced by a featureless wall of orange fog. Ramenzia was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours flying the Indonesian archipelago. He knew these skies like the back of his hand, but today his hands were gripped tight on the yoke. Beside him, First Officer Sutomo was cross-referencing their altitude with the approach charts for Medan. Usually the descent into North Sumatra was a scenic transition from the blue of the Indian Ocean to the lush green of the jungle. Today it felt like flying into a bowl of thick soup. In the cabin of Garuda Indonesia Flight 152, the 222 passengers were settling in for the final leg of the journey from Jakarta. A young businessman named Adi leaned against the window trying to spot the familiar landmarks of his home city. All he could see was the reflection of his own tired face in the glass. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of a distant campfire, a scent that most Indonesians had become accustomed to during that long, dry summer. Adi checked his watch, noting they were only minutes away from landing. He thought about his wife and daughter waiting for him at the terminal, likely wearing the same surgical masks everyone in Medan was using to filter the smoke. The flight had been smooth, the kind of routine trip he took twice a month for work. He adjusted his tie and closed his eyes, trusting the steady hum of the engines and the professional silence of the flight crew to bring him home safely. Ramenzia adjusted the frequency on his radio, listening to the crackle of the Medan air traffic control. The voice on the other end sounded just as tired as he felt. For months, the forest fires had been burning out of control across the region, fueled by a severe El Niño drought. Peatlands that had been damp for centuries were now tinderboxes. The smoke was so thick it had become its own weather system, trapping heat and erasing the world for millions of people on the ground below. Sutomo checked the fuel levels, calculating their reserves in case they were forced to circle. The visibility at the airport was reported at 400 meters, which was right on the edge of their legal landing limits. He looked at the captain and saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. They had both been working extra shifts to keep up with the disrupted flight schedules. In a region where the sun had been hidden for weeks, the passage of time felt sluggish and heavy for everyone. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant named Maya began her final safety check. She moved with a practiced grace, her smile steady even as the plane hit a pocket of warm, turbulent air. She checked that the overhead bins were latched and that every passenger had their seatbelt fastened. Maya had lived in Jakarta her whole life, but she loved the approach into Medan because of the way the mountains looked at sunset. Today those mountains were invisible, swallowed by the orange wall. Adi watched Maya move down the aisle, her presence a calming influence on the few passengers who were starting to look nervously out the windows. The orange light outside seemed to be getting darker, a deep ochre that suggested they were descending into the heart of the haze. He felt the familiar pressure in his ears as the plane began its descent. He reached into his seat pocket and pulled out a photo of his daughter, her smiling face, a stark contrast to the grim, monochromatic world outside. Ramenzia received the instruction to descend to 3,000 feet. He acknowledged the command, his voice calm and professional. He was flying entirely by instruments now, his eyes darting between the altimeter, the vertical speed indicator, and the navigation display. The orange fog was so dense that the wingtips of the massive Airbus were barely visible. It was a sensory deprivation tank at 300 miles per hour. He felt the vibration of the engines through the floor. Sutomo monitored the descent rate, his hand hovering near the flap lever. He knew that the terrain around Medan was treacherous, with several high peaks rising abruptly from the coastal plain. One of these was Mount Sibilangat, a jagged ridge that sat directly in the path of the southern approach. According to their navigation equipment, they were still miles away from the high ground, but the lack of visual confirmation made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Maya finished her check and took her seat at the back of the aircraft, buckling her 4-point harness. She looked across at her fellow attendant and gave a small nod. They were professionals, trained for every eventuality, but the atmosphere of this particular flight felt different. The smell of the smoke was stronger now, a sharp chemical tang that suggested they were flying through the actual plume of a nearby fire. She closed her eyes and waited for the wheels to touch down. The air traffic controller in the Medan tower squinted at his radar screen. The display was cluttered with interference from the heavy particulate matter in the air. He saw the green blip of Garuda 152 and realized they were slightly off course. He picked up his headset and prepared to issue a correction. He was managing several flights at once, all of them struggling with the near-zero visibility. His voice was a flat, rapid-fire monotone in the pilot's headsets. Ramenzia heard the controller's voice through the static. The instruction was to turn left to a heading of 240 degrees. Ramenzia repeated the instruction, but there was a moment of hesitation in his voice. He looked at his compass and then at Tsutomu. The turn felt wrong based on their previous position, but the controller had a better view of the overall traffic. He banked the heavy jet to the left, the wings cutting through the thick orange soup. Tsutomu watched the heading indicator spin slowly. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of unease. According to the charts, a left turn at this altitude would put them dangerously close to the foothills of the Barisan Mountains. He opened his mouth to speak, but the controller's voice came back over the radio, repeating the heading. In the high-pressure environment of a blind landing, the word of the tower was law. He kept his eyes on the radar altimeter, watching the numbers. Adi felt the plane bank sharply. It was a more aggressive maneuver than he was used to during a standard approach. He gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning white. The passenger next to him, an elderly woman, was clutching a prayer bead, her lips moving in a silent rhythm. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the rushing of air over the fuselage and the low, heavy groan of the hydraulic systems as the landing gear was cycled. The orange light was fading into a dark, muddy gray. The air traffic controller realized his mistake almost immediately. He had confused the position of Garuda 152 with another flight on his screen. He frantically keyed his radio to tell Ramansia to turn right immediately to a heading of 015 degrees. But the airwaves were crowded with other pilots calling in their positions. The seconds ticked by as he waited for a gap in the transmissions. His palms were sweating against the plastic of the radio console. Ramansia heard the new instruction through a burst of static. The command was to turn right. He felt a flash of frustration. The conflicting orders were making it impossible to establish a stable glide path. He began the right turn, but the plane was already lower than it should have been. He checked his altimeter and saw they were passing through 1,500 feet. The orange haze was now so thick it looked like solid earth. He felt a low-frequency vibration. Tsutomu looked at the ground proximity warning system. The display remained dark, but he could feel the air becoming more turbulent. The mountains were there somewhere in the orange void, and they were getting closer. He reached for the throttle, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at the captain, wanting to see a sign of confidence, but Ramansia was focused entirely on the instruments. The cockpit was filled with the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the flight computer. Maya felt the plane jerk to the right. The angle of the bank was so steep that she felt herself being pushed into her seat. She looked out the small porthole in the door and saw something that made her heart stop. Through a brief thinning of the smoke, she saw the dark, jagged shape of a tree branch. It was only a flash, a dark streak against the gray, but it shouldn't have been there. They were supposed to be thousands of feet above the jungle canopy. The air traffic controller finally got through. He shouted for Garuda 152 to pull up to climb to 5,000 feet immediately. His voice was no longer a professional monotone. It was a frantic, high-pitched scream. He watched the green blip on his screen. It was moving toward the dark shaded area that represented Mount Sibilangat. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the display, hoping to see the blip start to move away from the high ground. Ramansia heard the scream in his ears and reacted instantly. He slammed the throttles forward to full power and pulled back on the yoke. The engines roared, their sound changing from a low hum to a high-pitched metallic scream. The plane began to tilt its nose upward, fighting against its own momentum. But as the nose rose, the orange fog suddenly parted. Directly in front of the cockpit windows was a solid wall of green and brown. It was the mountain. Tsutomu saw the trees a split second after the captain. They were massive tropical hardwoods, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the smoke. He heard a sound like 1,000 dry sticks breaking at once. It was the sound of the wings clipping the top of the forest. The plane shuddered, a violent bone-shaking vibration that threw him against his harness. The cockpit was filled with the sound of snapping metal and the roar of the engines fighting for air. Addy was thrown forward into the seat in front of him as the plane suddenly bucked. He heard a sound he would never forget, a long, high-pitched scratching sound that ran the entire length of the cabin. It sounded like the world was being torn open. The lights in the cabin flickered once and then went out, leaving them in a terrifying, smoky darkness. He felt a sudden intense heat and the smell of jet fuel. He gripped the photo of his daughter. The investigation into the 1997 disaster on Mount Sibalangat was one of the most complex in Indonesian history. The black box was recovered from the shattered remains of the fuselage deep within the jungle. Investigators spent months listening to the final minutes of the cockpit voice recorder. They heard the confusion, the conflicting orders from the tower, and the final desperate roar of the engines. It was a tragedy written in the language of miscommunication. The smoke was the primary antagonist in every forensic report. It wasn't just a visual obstacle. It was a physical weight that had disoriented the air traffic controllers and blinded the pilots. The Great Haze had created a situation where the standard rules of aviation no longer applied. The investigators realized that the controller had been looking at a radar screen that was essentially a ghost of the truth, filtered through layers of burning peat and ash. The left-right confusion became a central theme of the case. The controller had intended to keep the plane away from the mountains, but in the chaos of the haze, he had given the exact opposite instruction. By the time he realized the error, the plane was already in a valley that left no room for a turn. The environmental dominoes had fallen. The fires on the ground had led to the haze had led to the confusion, and the confusion had led to the impact. The physical remains of the Airbus were scattered over a square mile of the mountainside. The plane had hit the trees and disintegrated the fuel tanks, exploding on impact. There were no survivors. 234 people had vanished into the orange fog in a matter of seconds. The recovery effort was hampered by the same smoke that had caused the crash, with rescuers forced to wear heavy respirators as they navigated the jagged, burning terrain of the crash site. The killer detail in the final report was the concentration of particulate matter in the air at the time of the approach. The soot was so thick, it had actually began to clog the cooling systems of the aircraft's electronics, potentially leading to the sluggish response of the navigation displays. The air itself had become a hostile medium, a solid barrier that had turned a state-of-the-art machine into a blind, stumbling weight. The environment had acted as a perfect trap. The tragedy led to a total overhaul of aviation safety in Southeast Asia, particularly concerning reduced visibility protocols. It also forced the first major ASEAN treaties on transboundary haze, as neighboring countries realized that the smoke from one nation's fires could lead to a catastrophe in another's sky. The 1997 haze is still remembered as one of the worst environmental disasters of the 20th century, a man-made plague that had global consequences. As of 2026, a quiet memorial stands on the slopes of Mount Sibalangat. It is a simple stone marker surrounded by the same jungle that claimed the lives of those on board Garuda 152. The trees have grown back their green canopy, hiding the scars on the mountainside. But for the families of the victims, the mountain remains a place of deep orange shadows. Every year on the anniversary, they gather to remember the flight that never made it home. Sumatra is a world of heat and thick, heavy air where the jungle breathes its own moisture. But if you move north to the border of Poland and Slovakia, the air is thin and sharp, and the whiteout is made of ice instead of smoke. On those jagged granite peaks, the ground can disappear just as quickly as it did in the haze, leaving a group of hikers standing on nothing but frozen air. It was 5 in the morning in early 1997, and the ridge of the High Tatras was a world of jagged black granite and frozen silence. A pair of skis stood perfectly upright in a drift of fresh powder, their tips pointing toward a sky that was just beginning to turn a bruised winter purple. The wind was low, a soft hiss across the ice that sounded like someone whispering in an empty room. There were no tracks leading to the skis. The wind had already begun to erase the history of the previous night. Janusz adjusted his goggles and looked out over the valley that separated Poland from Slovakia. At 22 years old, he was a student athlete at the university in Krakow, and his legs felt like coiled springs even after 3 days on the trail. He was a man who lived for the high country, someone who spent his weekdays studying mechanical engineering and his weekends testing the limits of his own endurance in the granite peaks of his homeland. He checked the binding on his left ski, the rhythmic clicking of the plastic and metal echoing in the thin, cold air. Janusz was the unofficial leader of the group, the one who had spent weeks poring over topographic maps and checking weather reports from the mountain stations. He carried a sense of quiet responsibility for his 4 friends, a weight that felt as natural to him as the heavy pack strapped to his shoulders. To him, the mountains were a logic puzzle that could always be solved with preparation. Back in the crowded dormitories of Krakow, the group was known for their relentless energy. They were the ones who would spend their Friday nights packing gear instead of at the bars, their conversations filled with talk of crampons, base layers, and the elusive perfect line down a mountain face. Marek, Kasia, Tomek, and Philip were more than just classmates. They were a unit. They had trained together in the gyms and on the smaller hills, building a level of trust that was essential for a winter traverse. Marek was the strongest of the 4, a former competitive cross-country runner with a resting heart rate that baffled the university doctors. He was the one who usually broke the trail his skis, carving a steady path through the deep snow while the others followed in his slipstream. He didn't talk much on the mountain, preferring to let the rhythm of his breathing and the steady push of his poles tell the story of his progress. He found a peace in the exertion that the city could never provide. Kasia was the youngest, a 19-year-old biology student who saw the Tatras as a living laboratory. She would often stop to examine the tiny lichens clinging to the rocks or the way the ice crystals formed on the pine needles. She was the one who kept the group's spirits up with a sharp wit and a bag of dried fruit that she always seemed to have tucked away in an accessible pocket. She was fit and fast, her movements on the snow as graceful as a dancer's. Tomek and Philip were the jokers of the group, 2 childhood friends who had followed each other into mountaineering. They were the ones who would start a snowball fight during a lunch break or make a bet about who would be the first to reach the next trail marker. They were competent hikers, but they leaned on Janusz's technical knowledge and Marek's physical strength. In 1997, their gear was top of the line, bright Gore-Tex jackets and heavy plastic boots that felt like armor. The group had been planning this specific traverse of the High Tatras for months. It was a route that followed the spine of the mountain range, offering views that stretched for 50 miles on a clear day. They had started their journey under a brilliant cold sun, their spirits high as they left the crowded tourist trails near Zakopane and headed into the jagged wilderness of the high peaks. The first 2 days had been a dream of crisp air and perfect powdery snow. Janusz led them through a narrow pass known as the 5 Lakes Valley. The frozen water below looked like sheets of gray steel tucked into the hollows of the granite. They moved with a steady, synchronized rhythm, the sound of their skis, a constant, comforting background noise. They felt a sense of ownership over the landscape, a belief that their physical fitness and their preparation had earned them a place in this vertical world. They were at the peak of their lives and the peak of Poland. By midday on the 3rd day, they reached a high plateau near a rock formation known as the Monk. It was a jagged pillar of granite that stood like a silent sentinel over the border. The light was starting to change the brilliant blue of the morning, fading into a flat, monochromatic gray. Janusz checked his watch and noted that the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last hour. He looked at the horizon, but the distant peaks were already beginning to vanish behind a veil of soft clouds. Marek felt the wind shift first. It wasn't a sudden gust, but a steady cold pressure that seemed to push against his chest. He stopped to adjust his hood, the fabric snapping in the rising wind. He looked back at Kasia and gave a quick thumbs up, but his face was serious. He knew that in the High Tatras, the weather didn't just change. It arrived with a physical force that could transform a safe trail into a labyrinth in a matter of minutes. He began to pick up the pace. Kasia noticed that the snow was no longer just something beneath her skis. It was now in the air, a fine, stinging dust that whipped across her goggles and forced her to look down at the tips of her skis. The silence of the morning had been replaced by a low-frequency hum, the sound of the wind vibrating through the jagged granite ridges above them. She felt a sudden sharp prickle of cold on her cheeks, the air turning into 1,000 tiny needles that sought out any gap in her clothing. The first offbeat detail was a trail marker that seemed to have moved. Janusz stopped at a wooden post that was supposed to mark a sharp turn toward the shelter, but the markings were caked in a layer of frozen sleet. He wiped them clean with a gloved hand, his fingers feeling stiff and clumsy. The arrow pointed into a white void. He looked at his compass, but the needle seemed to be hunting for a north that didn't exist. The air was becoming a solid white wall. Pressure was rising as the visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Tomek and Philip were now walking so close to Marek that their skis would occasionally clack together. They were no longer joking. The wind was a howling, chaotic force that made it impossible to hear each other without screaming. The temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, with the wind chill a level of cold that doesn't just bite, it drains the life out of the body through the very breath in the lungs. Janusz knew they were in a total whiteout. In this state, the human brain loses the ability to distinguish between the ground and the sky. There is no horizon, no depth, and no sense of scale. He felt a wave of disorientation wash over him, a feeling of weightlessness, as if he were floating in a jar of milk. He ordered everyone to stay together, their bright jackets, the only points of color in a world that had become entirely monochromatic and hostile. They spent 2 hours moving at a crawl, their bodies hunched against the gale. Janusz was looking for the ridge that would lead them down to the mountain hut. He remembered the map perfectly, a long, flat traverse, followed by a gentle descent to the east. He felt the ground beneath his skis, and it seemed solid and level. He signaled for the group to follow him, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He believed they were finally on the path to safety. Discovery came when the ground stopped behaving like rock. Janusz took a step forward, and instead of the firm resistance of the granite, he felt a strange elastic softness beneath his skis. He paused, his muscles tensing. He looked down, but he could only see the white powder swirling around his boots. He assumed it was just a deep drift of snow, a common occurrence on the high ridges. He encouraged the group to keep moving, his voice lost in the roar of the wind. The investigation into what happened on that ridge began 3 days later when the storm finally broke. The Tatra Volunteer Search and Rescue, known as TOPPER, was alerted when the students failed to check in at the university. A team of 20 rescuers moved into the high country, their movement hampered by the massive amount of new snow. They followed the coordinates from the group's original plan, their eyes scanning the pristine white slopes for anything that didn't belong. Rescuers found the first set of skis near a precipice that the locals called the edge of the world. The skis were standing upright, a traditional signal used by mountaineers to mark a camp or a position. But there was no camp. The topper team moved toward the edge with extreme caution, tethered together by heavy climbing ropes. They realized that the geography of the ridge had been fundamentally altered by the storm, creating a massive unstable overhang that shouldn't have been there. The search teams used long steel probes to check the snow, their movements methodical and somber. They found 4 of the students in the valley 500 feet below the ridge. The impact had been immediate and final. It took the rescuers another 12 hours to locate the 5th member of the group. They found a small frozen hole in a snowbank, halfway down the slope, a tiny burrow that had been dug with bare hands. Inside was the survivor, his body curled into a ball. The twist in the case was the nature of the ground they had been walking on. Janusz hadn't led them onto the trail. In the whiteout, they had drifted 30 yards to the left of the actual path. They were standing on a cornice, a massive cantilevered ledge of snow and ice that is built out from a ridge by the wind. A cornice has no rock beneath it. It is a frozen trapdoor over thin air. To the students in the whiteout, the cornice felt as solid as the mountain itself, until it wasn't. The golden ratio of the story reveals that the cornice had likely been growing for days, pushed out by the prevailing winds, until it extended 20 feet over the abyss. When Janusz and his friends stepped onto it, their combined weight acted like a lever. The crack that followed was as loud as a gunshot, a structural failure of the ice that sent thousands of tons of snow and 5 human beings into a freefall. They had been walking on nothing but air and frozen dust. Climax arrived for the survivor in the darkness of his snow hole. He had survived the fall because he had been at the very back of the line, landing on the softest part of the debris. He had spent 48 hours in a state of terminal, burrowing a survival instinct where the brain forces the body to dig into the snow for warmth. He had kept his heart beating by running in place in a tiny cramped space, his mind a blur of grief and the rhythmic thumping of his own blood. The truth of the Tatra disaster is a lesson in the sensory deprivation of the mountains. In a whiteout, the human inner ear and the eyes begin to fight over the sense of balance. The students didn't know they were on the edge because the mountain had stripped away the data they needed to survive. The ghost of the Monk Rock Formation had likely disoriented Janusz, leading him to believe the ridge curved in a direction it did not. They were betrayed by their own biology. The killer detail in the investigation was the rock known as the Monk. Rescuers noted that the rock's shape creates a unique wind tunnel that can cause snow to accumulate in false paths that look exactly like the marked trail from above. Janusz had followed a path made of wind instead of stone. The students were experienced and fit, but they were no match for the geometry of a storm that could build a bridge to nowhere in the middle of a border crossing. As of 2026, the 1997 tragedy is the definitive warning for all Polish hikers. A memorial plaque stands at the university in Krakow, and every year members of Topper lead a safety seminar focused specifically on the identification of cornices in low visibility. The route they took is now fitted with digital beacons that provide real-time weather alerts to hikers' phones. The survivor never returned to the high peaks, choosing instead to live in the lowlands, where the ground stays solid. The snow has a way of hiding the ground until it is too late, turning a flat path into a vertical drop. But in a derelict warehouse in Manchester, the ground was used for a different kind of concealment, a secret that was wrapped in a piece of old carpet and tucked away beneath the floorboards. A phone left on a kitchen counter. That is all it was. In the next case, it was a vintage pinafore dress emerging from the gray dust of a construction site. January 1998 in Manchester was a season of gray rain and cold heavy air that seemed to stick to the brickwork of the old industrial buildings. A demolition worker named David stood in the center of a derelict warehouse in a district they called Angel Meadow. He was 32 years over, and his job that morning was simple: strip the rotted floorboards to make way for a new apartment complex. The air inside the hollowed-out building smelled of damp earth and decades of settled soot. Angel Meadow had once been a place of crowded slums, but by the 1970s it was a landscape of crumbling warehouses. The woman who would be found there likely walked these streets when the local pubs were still bright. She lived a life of routine, wearing a blue jumper and a patterned pinafore dress. She was someone's neighbor, a face in the crowd of a city that was moving too fast to notice a single ripple disappearing from the surface of its history. She would have felt the cold Manchester wind biting at her neck as she hurried home through the damp evening. The orange glow of the street lamps reflected off the wet cobblestones, casting long, wavering shadows against the soot-stained brick. Her world was small, defined by the shops she visited and the people she passed in the hallways of her building. She carried the weight of her own secrets and her own dreams, unaware that the city was slowly turning her into a ghost before she even reached the end of the block. David swung his crowbar into a stubborn section of the floor, the wood groaning and splintering under the pressure. As the heavy plank came free, he expected to see nothing but the dark, sandy soil of the foundation. Instead, his flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something soft and colorful amidst the gray dust. It was a fragment of fabric, a vintage pattern of green and orange that looked startlingly bright against the rot. He knelt down the grit of the warehouse floor, crunching beneath his heavy work boots. He reached out to pull at the material, thinking it was just a piece of old rags or a discarded blanket left behind by a squatter. But as he tugged, the fabric didn't give way. It was wrapped tightly around something heavy and solid. The smell of the earth shifted, becoming sharp and metallic, a scent that made the hair on David's arms stand up. He realized the fabric wasn't a blanket, it was a dress, and it was still occupied. He dropped his tool, the sound of the metal hitting the stone floor echoing like a gunshot. The police arrived with the gray afternoon light cordoning off the site with yellow tape that snapped in the wind. Detective Teresa Lamb led the team into the basement, her eyes scanning the area for signs of a struggle that had happened 30 years prior. The body had been wrapped in a section of heavy patterned carpet, and tucked into a shallow void beneath the floorboards. It was a domestic burial, a way to keep a secret hidden directly beneath the feet of anyone who walked through the room. The warehouse had acted as a perfect vault. Forensic teams spent hours carefully removing the remains from the dirt. The woman was wearing a blue jumper over her pinafore dress, and her shoes were still on her feet. Despite the decades that had passed, the lack of oxygen beneath the floor had preserved the fibers of her clothing perfectly. She looked like a time capsule from the 1970s, a portrait of a decade that the city had long since tried to renovate away. Every button and every stitch was a piece of evidence for a life that had no name and no paper trail. The investigation moved into the local archives, searching through thousands of missing persons reports from the last 30 years. Detective Lamb looked for anyone who had vanished in a blue jumper, anyone whose family had stopped calling, anyone who had simply stopped existing. But the search came up empty. There was no record of her. It was as if she had never been born, never worked a job, and never paid rent. She was a total mystery, a woman who had been erased so completely that even the silence she left behind was anonymous. The somatic reality of the investigation was a heavy, persistent pressure in the detective's chest. Every time she looked at the photos of the pinafore dress, her own breathing would become shallow and her muscles would tense. She could feel the weight of the warehouse floor the way it must have felt to be hidden in the dark while the city moved on above. The angel of the meadow was a ghost who refused to leave a presence that demanded a name the world could not provide. Her heartbeat felt like a hammer against her ribs. By 2026, technology had finally begun to peel back the layers of the mystery. Forensic artists used advanced digital mapping to reconstruct the woman's face from her skeletal remains. The result was a hauntingly lifelike image of a young woman with a steady gaze and a half-smile. This new portrait was shared across international databases using genetic genealogy to search for a distant cousin or a long-lost sibling. The search is still active, a digital hunt for the identity of a woman who was tucked away in a roll of carpet. The killer detail remains the choice of burial. To wrap a body in carpet and hide it beneath your own floor suggests a personal connection, a need to keep the victim close, or a desperate fear of being caught. The perpetrator likely lived or worked in that warehouse, walking over the secret every day for decades. They moved through the world with the knowledge of what lay beneath the boards, listening to the silence of the woman they had silenced. The identity of the killer, like the identity of the angel, remains a shadow in the history of Manchester. Sometimes a person is forgotten in the earth for 30 years, and the world only learns their name through the grit of a construction site. Other times the world watches them go in real time, lost to a sea that has no floor. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from witnessing a tragedy you cannot stop, where the only thing left to do is watch the mountains of water rise and wait for the weight to come down. A phone left on a kitchen counter. That's all it was. In the next case, it would be a radio call. The spray of the Tasman Sea was cold, but the sun was still high enough to make the deck of the Winston Churchill feel like a sanctuary. Richard Winning adjusted his grip on the wheel, feeling the steady vibration of the hull as it sliced through a moderate swell. It was December 26th, 1998. 115 boats were pushing south from Sydney Harbor, their white sails looking like a flock of birds against the deep blue of the afternoon. Richard was a man who understood the language of the ocean. At 45, he had spent a lifetime navigating these waters, and the Winston Churchill was more than just a boat to him. It was a classic, a 55-foot wooden hull built in the 1930s. While the newer boats were made of carbon fiber and light alloys, the Churchill had a weight and a history that made it feel invincible. Richard felt the solid resistance of the rudder, a physical connection to the heritage of Australian sailing. The crew was a tight-knit group of 9 men bound by years of shared watches and salt-crusted stories. They moved across the deck with the quiet efficiency of a team that didn't need to speak to know what the next man was doing. To them, the Sydney to Hobart was the ultimate holiday tradition. It was 628 nautical miles of tactical chess and physical endurance, a race that ended with cold beers and a hero's welcome in the harbor of Tasmania. Among the crew was John, a veteran sailor who had been with Richard on almost every race for a decade. He was the kind of man who could tell the wind speed by the sound it made through the rigging. He sat on the windward rail, his eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of the southerly change they all knew was coming. John lived for the moments when the city fell away and the world was reduced to the rhythm of the waves and the snap of the Dacron sails. The atmosphere on board was one of relaxed focus. They had spent weeks preparing the Churchill, checking every shackle and reinforced seam. In a race like this, the pressure is a slow burn. It's the constant calculation of tide and current, the management of fatigue, and the maintenance of the boat's momentum. Richard watched the sunlight dance on the brass fittings of the cabin house. He felt a deep sense of pride in his boat and his men, a belief that they could handle anything. The Sydney to Hobart is more than a race. It is a pilgrimage for the elite sailors of the Southern Hemisphere. Families stood on the cliffs of South Head, waving flags and cheering as the fleet cleared the harbor and entered the open sea. Richard could see the colorful spinnakers of the Maxis far ahead, looking like giant toys on the water. The sea was lively but predictable, a familiar playground for a man who had spent his youth learning how to read the clouds. They shared a meal of sandwiches and coffee as the sun began to set the sky, turning a soft, dusty pink. The temperature was dropping, but it was the kind of crisp cold that feels invigorating rather than threatening. Richard checked the radio for the evening weather report. The Bureau of Meteorology was calling for a low-pressure system in the Bass Strait, but in 1998 that was just a standard part of the race. They prepared their heavy weather gear with a casual, practiced air. John checked the barometer in the cabin. It was steady, a reassuring line on the chart. He thought about his wife and daughter back in Sydney, likely watching the race tracker on the television. The Churchill was a sturdy vessel built from heavy timbers that had survived storms much worse than what the forecast was suggesting. There was a comfort in the wood, a feeling that the boat was a living thing that knew its way home. He adjusted his harness and stepped back out into the cool evening air. The first few hours of the night were a dream of perfect sailing. The wind was behind them, and the Churchill was surfing down the swells with a grace that masked its weight. Richard took the first watch, his eyes fixed on the glowing compass. The stars were bright and clear, reflecting off the dark water like diamonds. It was the kind of night that made men fall in love with sailing all over again. The city lights of the coast were a distant, comforting glow on the western horizon. Richard's muscles were relaxed, his hands light on the wheel. He knew the geography of the coast by heart, the way the continental shelf dropped away and the currents shifted as they moved south. The Churchill was performing beautifully, its wooden hull humming with every surge of speed. There was a sense of invincibility that comes with a well-built boat and a clear sky. He felt the steady beat of his own heart, a calm rhythm that matched the easy rise and fall of the Tasman Sea. By midnight, the rest of the crew was tucked into the narrow bunks below. The sounds of the boat were a lullaby. The creak of the timber, the wash of the water against the hull, and the occasional muffled laugh from the men off watch. Richard enjoyed the solitude of the night helm. It was a time to think, to plan, and to feel the raw power of the elements. He believed that the Churchill was more than a match for the Bass Strait, a stretch of water known for its unpredictable moods. The race tracker showed them in the top third of the fleet. Richard was pleased with their progress. They were holding their own against boats half their age and twice their cost. The goal wasn't to win the line honors. It was to win the handicap, to prove that the old ways and the heavy boats still had a place in the modern world. He felt a deep connection to the history of the race, to the sailors who had navigated these waters long before GPS and satellite phones. As the morning of December 27th broke, the sky was a flat gray sheet. The sun didn't so much rise as it simply made the clouds look a little brighter. Richard noticed that the wind had shifted to the west and was beginning to build. The easy swells of the night were being replaced by short, choppy waves that made the Churchill buck and shiver. He called the crew on deck to shorten the sails. The atmosphere on the boat changed from relaxation to a sharp, professional focus. The first offbeat detail was the barometer. When John went below to check the reading, he found that the needle had dropped 10 points in less than an hour. It was a plummeting line that suggested the atmosphere wasn't just changing, it was collapsing. He looked at the chart, his brow furrowed. A drop like that usually meant a cyclone, but they were in the middle of a summer race in the Bass Strait. He tapped the glass, hoping the instrument was simply broken, but the needle didn't move. Richard felt a sudden cold pressure in the air. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming through the rigging with a high-pitched metallic whistle. The sea had changed color from a deep blue to a sickly, frothing white. Huge walls of water were beginning to build their tops, being torn off by the wind and turned into a stinging spray that made it impossible to see more than a few yards. This wasn't a storm. It was a weather bomb, a rare meteorological event where the pressure drops so fast the air literally falls into the sea. Pressure was rising at a terrifying rate. The waves were no longer rolling. They were vertical walls of water, some of them reaching heights of 80 feet. The Winston Churchill, despite its weight, was being tossed around like a cork. Richard gripped the wheel with both hands, his knuckles white as the boat climbed a mountain of water and then plummeted into a deep, dark valley on the other side. The sound was deafening, a chaotic roar of wind and crashing water that drowned out everything else. The discovery of the scale of the disaster came through the radio. Richard heard the first mayday call from a boat called the Sayonara, then another from the business post Naiad. 115 boats were being scattered across the Bass Strait like toy ships in a bathtub. Boats were rolling 360 degrees, masts were snapping like toothpicks, and men were being thrown into the freezing water. The race had vanished. In its place was a desperate war zone, where the only objective was to stay afloat. Richard looked at his crew. They were all harnessed to the boat, their faces pale and set in grim determination. They were working the pumps, trying to keep up with the water that was crashing over the deck with every wave. The Churchill was struggling. The wooden hull, which had felt so solid the day before, was now groaning under the immense pressure of the vertical seas. Richard felt a sudden sharp thud beneath his feet, a vibration that didn't feel like a wave. It felt like the boat was breaking. The rescue operation was the largest in Australian maritime history. Navy helicopters were launched from the coast, flying into winds of over 100 miles per hour. The pilots had to hover over masts that were pointing toward the seafloor, winching sailors from the tops of sinking boats while the ocean tried to swallow them whole. Richard heard the helicopters overhead their engines, a low-frequency thrum that competed with the roar of the wind. He realized that the Churchill was no longer a racing vessel. It was a target for the sea. Investigation into the radio logs later revealed the chaos of the night. The Australian coast was filled with voices screaming for help, many of them cut off in mid-sentence as their boats were overwhelmed. The rescuers were performing miracles, but the conditions were at the absolute limit of human endurance. Richard watched a massive pyramidal wave approach the Churchill. It was a mountain of water that didn't roll. It exploded. The boat was lifted into the air and then slammed down with a force that shattered the timber frames. The clue that changed the understanding of the disaster was the force of the water itself. It wasn't just the height of the waves, it was the G-force. Sailors reported being thrown through the decks by the sheer weight of the water hitting the boats. The ocean wasn't acting like a liquid, it was acting like a solid, crushing weight. Richard felt the Churchill begin to lose its buoyancy. The wooden hull, which had been his sanctuary for decades, was filling with water faster than the pumps could handle. The boat was dying beneath him. Richard made the hardest decision of his life. He called for the crew to abandon ship. They launched the life rafts, but the wind was so strong that the first raft was instantly shredded by the rigging. The men had to huddle together on the deck, waiting for a gap in the waves to launch the second raft. Richard watched as the Winston Churchill, his pride and joy, began its final descent into the abyss. The mast disappeared beneath the white foam, and the ocean closed over the spot where the boat had been for 60 years. The climax of the story unfolded in the life raft. For hours, the 9 men clung to each other as the raft was tossed around the Bass Strait. The cold was a physical pain, a deep, bone-shaking chill that made it hard to breathe. They watched the helicopters in the distance, their spotlights cutting through the dark, but the waves were so high that the raft was invisible in the troughs. Richard felt a sense of profound loss as he thought about his boat, but he focused entirely on the men in the raft, counting them over and over. The truth of the 1998 disaster was a combination of unique geography and a freak storm. The Bass Strait is shallow, and when a deep ocean swell meets the continental shelf during a storm, the waves become pyramidal. They don't have room to roll, so they stack up and explode. This created a landscape of shifting mountains that the boats were never designed to survive. The weather bomb had turned the ocean into a machine designed to crush anything on its surface, regardless of its weight or history. The killer detail in the aftermath was the safety overhaul. The race led to a total rethink of how yachts are built and how sailors are trained. New regulations were implemented for life rafts, communication equipment, and the stability of the hulls. The disaster of 1998 became the Mount Everest of sailing, a moment that redefined the human limit of endurance at sea. Richard and his crew were eventually rescued, but 3 men from the fleet were never found, their lives claimed by the White Sea. As of 2026, the 1998 Sydney to Hobart race remains the definitive warning for the global sailing community. A memorial service is held every year to remember the 6 sailors who lost their lives in the storm. Richard Winning continued to sail, but he never replaced the Churchill. The story of the wooden boat that fought the weather bomb is told in yacht clubs around the world, a reminder that the ocean is a power that can never be fully mastered, only survived. The ocean is a heavy, crushing weight that can erase a ship in seconds, turning a masterpiece of engineering into a memory in a single afternoon. But there is a different kind of weightlessness in the Andes, the weight of a man who killed hundreds of children and then simply walked away through a hospital gate. People talk about how dangerous the world is, but most of the time, the danger doesn't come from a 80-foot wave. It comes from someone who knows your name. August 1998. A heavy iron gate at a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá groans as it swings open. A man in his late 50s steps through. He is wearing a clean shirt and carries a small bag. He looks like any other grandfather you might pass on the street. He stops for a moment to feel the sun on his face squinting against the bright Colombian morning before blending into the city traffic and disappearing. In the late 1970s, the Andean highlands were a world of emerald slopes and quiet, dusty market squares. In villages like Ambato, life moved to the rhythm of the harvest and the church bells. Children spent their afternoons running through the stalls, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. They were kids who knew their neighbors by name and believed the mountains were a place of protection for everyone. A young girl named Maria might spend her morning helping her mother sell corn in the market. She was 10 years old with bright eyes and a quick smile. The world felt enormous and full of wonder. She moved through the crowds with a sense of freedom that only exists in places where trust is the local currency. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasted grains, and the sun was a warm, constant friend for the mountain people. The families in these towns didn't have much, but they had their community. They watched over one another's children with a collective eye. The danger they worried about was the weather or a poor harvest, not the stranger with the gentle voice. To them, a man who offered a small coin or a kind word was just another traveler passing through on the long road between the peaks. The mountain paths were their second home. These children were the heart of the Andes. They were the ones who would grow up to be the farmers and the weavers. They lived in a landscape of vertical beauty where the clouds often sat right on top of the roofs. Their days were filled with simple chores and the deep joy of a life lived in the open air. No one looked at the quiet man in the corner of the square with any suspicion. He was just part of the scenery. In 1980, the peace of the valley was shattered by a week of relentless rain. The earth softened and began to move, triggering a series of flash floods near Ambato. As the mud receded, the ground gave up secrets it had been holding for years. A local mother was walking near the riverbank when she saw something white protruding from the silt. It wasn't a stone, it was a small, delicate bone that changed everything. The police began to dig, and the numbers grew with every shovel strike. They didn't find one body, they found dozens. The scale of the discovery sent a shockwave through the country that turned into a frantic panic. Parents clutched their children tighter as the realization set in that a predator had been living among them. The hunt for the man responsible became a national obsession, a race to stop the bleeding of the mountains. A woman in the market finally recognized the face from the sketches. She pointed out a man who looked entirely ordinary, a man who was captured without a fight. His name was Pedro Lopez. When the investigators sat across from him, they expected a monster to growl. Instead, he began to speak in a calm, melodic voice. He didn't just confess to the murders in Ecuador. He told them he had killed over 300 children. Because of the laws in Ecuador at the time, the maximum sentence for any crime was 16 years. Even for a man who claimed 300 lives, the legal system had a ceiling. Lopez spent his years in a cell, often laughing, as he described his work to the prison guards. He was eventually moved to a Colombian psychiatric facility for evaluation. Doctors there watched him for months, trying to find the source of his darkness. By 1998, the doctors reached a conclusion that would haunt the region for decades. They declared Pedro Lopez sane and rehabilitated. Under the law, they could no longer hold him. They processed his release papers, handed him $50 in cash, and opened the door. The most prolific serial killer in human history was a free man again, walking back into the very population he had spent years terrorizing. The moment the news broke, the search began, but Lopez was gone. He didn't take a bus or leave a trail of credit card charges. He simply stepped into the crowd in Bogota and vanished. It was as if he had never existed. For years, the authorities waited for the sign that the monster had returned to the mountains. They checked every village and every market, but the trail remained cold. He had mastered the art of being invisible. His method was built on the stateless nature of the Andes. He would lure children with a single coin, promising them a treat or a small toy. He moved through the porous borders between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, knowing that the local police rarely talked to one another. He utilized the isolation of the mountain paths to ensure he was never seen, turning the beautiful landscape into a personal hunting ground that spanned 3 nations. The one detail that every witness remembered was his crooked grin. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a facial tic that seemed to mock the world around him. Even when he was confessing to the most horrific acts, he kept that small, twisted expression on his face. It was the only crack in his mundane mask, the only sign that the man standing before them was something other than a harmless traveler. As of 2026, Pedro Lopez remains an active Interpol fugitive. He would be in his late 70s now, and there has not been a confirmed sighting of him in over 25 years. Some believe he died in the jungle, while others fear he is living under a new name in a quiet village. His whereabouts are the ultimate cold case in South American history, a ghost that still haunts the high peaks of the Andes. He walked into the sun and disappeared, leaving a legacy of silence in the mountains. Sometimes the earth takes a person and hides them so well that even the law cannot find them. But at the top of the world there is a woman who stayed behind, frozen in the snow, becoming a permanent part of the mountain itself. The air there is thin, and the light is a different kind of white that hides the truth. A flash of bright purple against the white glare of the north face was the first thing they noticed. It was sitting on a narrow ledge nearly 28,000 feet above the rest of the world. At that height, the air is thin enough to starve the brain of its basic functions. The wind hissed over the limestone, but the purple jacket didn't move. It sat perfectly still, a man-made color in a landscape of gray rock and ice. The ledge was small, no wider than a twin bed, and it hung over a drop that disappeared into the clouds thousands of feet below. To anyone looking from a distance, it appeared like a small piece of trash left behind by a careless expedition. But as the sun moved across the sky, the shadows shifted, revealing the shape of a person huddled against the stone. There was no movement, no sign of life, just the steady, indifferent blow of the high-altitude wind. Francis Arcentiev was 40 years old, a woman from Colorado who had spent her life chasing the thin air of the world's highest peaks. She was not a casual hiker. She was an elite climber with a resume that spanned continents. Back home, she was a mother and a wife who loved the mountains for the clarity they provided. She worked in the city, but her mind was always drifting toward the vertical wilderness of the high altitudes. She lived in a world where the air was thick and the ground was flat, but she never truly felt at home there. She spent her days navigating the mundane realities of school runs and office meetings, her thoughts often straying to the jagged horizons of the Rockies. To her neighbors, she was a kind, quiet woman who seemed to possess a hidden reservoir of strength. She had a way of looking at the world as if she were always searching for the next peak. She had met her husband Sergei through the community of high-altitude mountaineering. He was a legendary Russian climber, a man of few words and incredible physical strength. He had been the one to summit the world's most dangerous mountains, often in conditions that would break a normal person. Together, they shared a dream of climbing Everest in the most difficult way possible. They wanted to stand on the peak without using any supplemental oxygen. In the climbing world, this is considered the purest form of the sport, a test of biology against the void. It requires a level of physical conditioning and mental toughness that very few people possess. Francis and Sergei spent years preparing for this goal. They lived in a world of technical gear, frozen ropes, and the constant management of risk. To their friends, they were a partnership that seemed unbreakable, two halves of a single climbing soul. They spent their evenings in their small home, the walls covered in maps and photographs of distant ranges. They talked about the physics of the death zone, that place above 26,000 feet where the human body literally begins to consume itself to stay alive. They understood the stakes, the way the oxygen-starved brain can trick the senses into seeing things that aren't there. They were students of the mountain, preparing for every eventuality. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared language of the high country. Sergei didn't need to tell Frances that he loved her. He showed it in the way he checked her harness and the way he paced himself to match her stride. They were a unit, a team that functioned with a synchronized rhythm. They knew that on Everest, the person beside you is the only thing that stands between life and a permanent residence in the snow. In May of 1998, they finally arrived at the North Base camp on the Tibetan side of the mountain. The peak was a massive white pyramid that dominated every view, its plume of snow blowing like a white flag in the jet stream. They spent weeks acclimatizing, moving slowly up the lower ridges to let their blood thicken and their lungs adapt. Frances felt strong, her breathing steady even as the air became increasingly scarce with every camp. She watched the other expeditions using heavy oxygen tanks and felt a quiet pride in their decision to go without. To her, the tanks were a crutch, a way of avoiding the true reality of the mountain. She wanted to know what she was capable of when she was stripped down to her core. She spent her afternoons in the mess tent drinking hot tea and watching the weather reports. The mountain was a silent observer waiting for them to make their first move. They shared quiet meals in their small tent at Camp 6, the sound of the wind, a constant booming background noise. They talked about the descent, the hot meals they would eat in town, and the family waiting for them back in the States. Sergei checked their gear one last time with a practiced rhythmic precision. He looked at Frances with a silent respect that didn't need words. They were ready to make their final push for the summit that night. The plan was to move fast and light. They would wait for a window of clear weather and then climb through the dark to reach the peak by dawn. Frances felt a sense of calm as she tightened the laces on her heavy boots. She was a woman of focus and grit, a climber who knew that the mountain doesn't give anything away for free. She took a deep breath of the freezing air and stepped out onto the ice, her husband following close behind her in the dark. They moved in a steady rhythmic pattern, their headlamps casting long dancing shadows against the snow. Every step required a conscious effort, a conversation between the brain and the muscles. The air was so thin that Frances had to stop every few minutes to catch her breath, her chest heaving as she fought for every molecule of oxygen. But she kept moving, her eyes fixed on the heels of Sergei's boots. They were a team, and the summit was finally within reach. The climb was a blur of frozen rock and thin, cold air. They moved past the skeletons of old tents and the discarded oxygen bottles of previous years. The world below had vanished, replaced by a vast black void. They reached the top, just as the first light of dawn was hitting the peaks of the surrounding ranges. They stood there for a few minutes, two small figures at the highest point on Earth, looking out over a world that few people would ever see. The descent was supposed to be the victory lap, but in the dark of the high ridges, the world became a blur of shadows. They had reached the summit, but the effort had taken more from them than they realized. On the way down, the wind began to build, and the temperature plummeted. In the middle of a steep section, Frances looked back and realized Sergei was no longer there. The silence of the mountain had swallowed the sound of his footsteps. She stopped and shouted his name, her voice a thin, raspy sound that was instantly lost in the gale. She looked back up the ridge, but she could see nothing but the swirling white snow and the jagged limestone. She assumed he had slowed down to adjust his gear and would be along in a moment. She waited for 5 minutes, then 10, her body starting to shiver as the heat left her limbs. The mountain was no longer a friend, it was becoming an obstacle. The realization that she was alone at 28,000 feet hit her with a sudden, sharp coldness. She knew the rules of the high country. If you stop moving, you die. She tried to climb back up to find him, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Every movement required an immense amount of willpower. She looked at the dark ridge one last time and then began to descend toward the safety of the lower camps, hoping that Sergei would find his own way down. As the night wore on, Frances found that she could no longer keep her balance. The lack of oxygen was beginning to affect her motor skills, her movements becoming clumsy and slow. She wandered off the main path, her mind a fog of exhaustion and cold. She found a small sloping ledge and realized she could go no further. She sat down her back against the frozen rock and pulled her knees to her chest. She was alone in the death zone, and the sun was setting. The cold was a physical weight, a pressure that seemed to slow her heartbeat. She fought to keep her eyes open, knowing that if she fell asleep, she might never wake up. She thought about her children, the sound of their laughter, and the warmth of her home. The silence of the mountain was deafening, a heavy, airless weight that pressed against her ears. She watched the stars come out, their light cold and indifferent. She was a prisoner of the altitude. By the early hours of the morning, she had lost the feeling in her hands and feet. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a terrifying heavy warmth that she knew was the final stage of hypothermia. She could no longer remember why she was on the mountain or who she was waiting for. Her world had shrunk to the few feet of rock around her and the sound of her own gasping breath. She was becoming a part of the stone, a feature of the North Face. The next morning, 2 South African climbers were making their own push for the summit. As they rounded a corner on the ridge, they saw the flash of bright purple against the snow. They thought it was a discarded pack until they got closer and saw the slight movement of a shoulder. They scrambled down to the ledge, their hearts thumping in their chests. They found Francie still alive, her eyes open but clouded by the fog of hypoxia. She looked up at them, her lips blue and her skin a waxy, translucent white. She seemed to be trying to speak, but her words were just a series of soft, raspy clicks. The lead climber knelt beside her, checking for a pulse and trying to find a way to warm her up. He had seen many things on the mountain, but the sight of a woman sitting alone at 28,000 feet was something that defied logic. He asked her what had happened, but she could only stare at him. The second climber checked the area for any sign of a partner or an oxygen bottle. She found nothing but the empty space of the ridge. They realized that Frances had spent the entire night alone without any supplemental air. It was a biological miracle that she was still breathing, but they could see that she was fading fast. They began to massage her hands and talk to her, trying to pull her back from the edge of the darkness. The sun was rising, but the air remained freezing. The 2 climbers stopped their ascent, the gravity of the situation hitting them like a physical blow. They asked her where Sergei was, but she couldn't answer. They scanned the ridges with their binoculars, looking for any sign of another climber, but the mountain was empty. They debated what to do. They were at the limit of their own physical endurance, and they were using oxygen tanks that had a limited supply. Every minute they stayed on the ledge was a minute they lost. Later, they would find out that other climbers had seen Sergei searching for Frances throughout the night. A group of climbers had passed him on the way up, noting that he looked exhausted and disoriented. He had been seen wandering the ridges with his ice axe in hand, a ghost looking for his partner in the dark. He had even been spotted heading back up toward the summit, a final desperate move to find his wife. He had vanished into the thin air. The search for Sergei became a central theme of the stories told in the base camp that week. Some believed he had fallen, while others thought he had simply walked off into the void in his grief. The mountain had taken one half of the unit, and now it was claiming the other. The 2 climbers felt the weight of the investigation as they sat on the ledge. They were the only ones who knew she was still alive, and they were the only ones who could help her. They checked her gear and found that she had no injuries, no broken bones, and no signs of a fall. She had simply run out of energy. The mountain hadn't used violence to stop her. It had used the slow, grinding force of its own atmosphere. They realized that the pure ascent had left her with no reserves. She had given everything to reach the summit, and now there was nothing left to get her back down. She was a biological engine that had run out of fuel. The 2 climbers spent over an hour trying to help her. They tried to lift her, but at that altitude, even standing up is an immense struggle. Every time they tried to move her, she would moan in pain, her body refusing to cooperate. They realized with a cold, sharp clarity that they could not move her. To stay and try to carry her down meant that they would also run out of oxygen and die on the ledge. It was the impossible choice of the high altitude. They looked at each other, the realization of what they had to do, passing between them in a silent, agonizing second. They were elite climbers, people who lived for the challenge, but this was a challenge that could not be won. They had to look into her eyes and decide that their own lives were worth more than her rescue. The morality of the mountain is a brutal, stripped-down thing. There is no room for sentiment when your own heart is struggling to beat. They tried one last time to get her on her feet, but her legs were like water. She slumped back against the rock, her breathing becoming even more shallow. The lead climber felt a sense of profound failure as he let go of her arm. He knew that the moment he stood up and walked away, her fate would be sealed. He looked at the summit, then back at the woman in the purple jacket. The silence of the death zone was closing in, and the oxygen in his tank was dropping. Francie spoke only a few times, her voice a thin, raspy whisper that the wind tried to snatch away. She didn't ask about the summit or the weather. Her final words to the climbers were a simple, heartbreaking plea. She looked at them and said, "Don't leave me." It was a sentence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of a human being realizing that they were being left behind to die in the coldest place on Earth. The climbers sat with her for a few more minutes, holding her hand and talking to her about her home. They told her that help was coming, even though they knew it was a lie. They watched as her eyes began to close the fog of the altitude, finally winning the battle. They stood up slowly, their bodies feeling heavy and old. They checked their oxygen one last time and then began the long, silent walk back down the ridge. They didn't look back until they reached the lower camp. The biological failure was a result of hypoxia, a total lack of oxygen to the brain and organs. At 8,800 meters, the body can no longer repair its own cells. The capillaries in the lungs leak, and the brain begins to swell, leading to a loss of motor control and eventual coma. Francie's hadn't fallen or been hit by an avalanche. Her body had simply ceased to function. She had fallen into a deep frozen sleep, becoming a permanent part of the landscape. The mountain had used its environment as a slow-motion eraser. By drawing her into the thin air without the protection of oxygen, it had systematically shut down her systems one by one. First her coordination, then her warmth, and finally her consciousness. It was a method that required no action on the part of the mountain itself. It simply waited for the biology of the climber to fail. Francie's had become a landmark, a flash of purple in a world of gray. The mystery of Sergei was solved a year later. He was never seen alive again after he went back into the dark to find his wife. A search team found his body at the base of the mountain face, thousands of feet below where he had last been seen. He was found with his ice axe still clutched in his hand, a testament to the fact that he had died while still trying to reach her. He had never given up on his partner, following her into the silence of the North Face. For 9 years, Francie's remained on that ledge, known to all climbers as Sleeping Beauty. In 2007, one of the climbers who had left her returned to the mountain. He didn't climb for the summit. He went back to the North Face, wrapped her in an American flag, and moved her body away from the main path. As of 2026, she is no longer visible to anyone. She rests in the silence of the high snow, finally hidden from the world. The fire is getting low now, and the rain outside hasn't let up since we started this journey through the dark corners of the late 90s. I wanted to stay with you for just a foot more, even though the last story has officially ended. There is a specific kind of weight that settles in a room after you talk about the death zone and the people who never came back from the mountains or the sea. It is a heavy, quiet feeling that deserves a moment of reflection. We have traveled across continents tonight, from the red sandstone of Kenya to the white silence of the Bolivian salt flats. We've looked into the lives of people who were just like us, people who woke up, had their coffee, and assumed the world would behave the same way it did the day before. That is the thing about the vanishing point. It doesn't announce itself with a loud noise or a warning sign. It just waits for the moment when your back is turned or the light fails. I think about Shari Hull leaving that warehouse in Virginia, or the students in the High Tatras. They weren't looking for a struggle or a disaster. They were looking for home or the next trail marker. There is a lesson in that ordinary routine. We spend so much of our time building a sense of security, believing that our locks and our plans are enough to hold back the chaos. But as we've seen, the chaos is often much closer than we like to admit, hidden in the mundane. Take the Wakayama curry poisoning. That was a neighborhood that believed in the power of the collective. They thought that because they knew each other, they were safe. But the danger wasn't a stranger coming from outside the gate. It was the person stirring the pot right in front of them. It makes you wonder about the faces we see every day, the people we share our lives with, and how much we truly know about the secrets they keep behind a neighborly smile. And then there is the indifference of nature. The weather bomb in the Bass Strait or the flash flood in Hell's Gate. Nature doesn't have a motive. It doesn't hate the sailors on the Winston Churchill or the youth group in the gorge. It just functions according to its own brutal physical laws. It reminds us that we are guests on this planet, and sometimes the environment decides that it is time for the ground to shift or the water to rise without any regard for our plans. There is something particularly haunting about the stories of the body in the piano and the angel of the meadow. These are stories of people who were deleted from the map of the world while they were in the middle of a crowd. It is the ultimate anonymity. You can be hidden beneath a floorboard in a busy city for 30 years, and no one asks where you went. It makes you realize how fragile our connections are and how easily a human being can become a ghost in the city. We looked at the case of Pedro Lopez, the man who walked out of a hospital gate with $50 and a crooked grin. That is a different kind of horror. It is the failure of our own systems, the realization that sometimes the monsters are legally allowed to walk back into the sun. It leaves a residue of unease that is hard to shake. We want to believe in justice and order, but the ghost of the Andes proves that sometimes the darkness just slips away into the crowd. And finally, the story of Francis Arsentiev on Everest. It forces us to look at the most uncomfortable part of being human, the choice between someone else's life and our own. We all like to think we would be the hero. We think we would stay on that ledge and fight until the end. But when the oxygen is gone and the cold is absolute, the biology of survival takes over. It is a morality play stripped of all the comforts and the high-minded ideals of our everyday lives. These stories aren't meant to make you afraid of the world, though I know they can be unsettling. They are meant to remind us of the value of the present moment. Every time we walk through our own front door and hear the lock click, it is a victory. Every time we sit down for a meal with people, we trust it is a privilege. We tell these stories at 2 a.m. because the darkness helps us appreciate the light we often take for granted in the heat of the day. I am looking at the rain hitting the window and thinking about how lucky we are to be on this side of the glass. The people in these stories didn't get to choose their ending. They were caught in a chain of consequences that was often invisible until it was too late. But we are here. We have the chance to listen, to learn, and to carry the memory of those who were lost. Their stories are a way of ensuring that their vanishing wasn't a total and final erasure from history. There is a common thread in all these events from 1998 and 1997. It is the importance of a name. Whether it is the piano man or the angel of the meadow, the most tragic part of the story is the loss of identity. When we give these people their names back, or at least keep their memories alive, we are fighting against the void. We are saying that their lives mattered, even if the world tried to fold them away into the dust and the dark. I want you to take a breath and feel the weight of your own presence in this room. You are safe, the fire is still warm, and the rain is just a sound, not a threat. We face the darkness together in these stories so that we can walk through our own lives with a bit more awareness. We look at the weather bomb and the mirror trap so that we can recognize the small warnings in our own paths. Awareness is the only real shield we have in a world of unpredictable variables. If you are still awake, I hope these reflections have brought you a sense of perspective. Life is a collection of ordinary moments that we often ignore, but those are the moments that truly define us. The hikers in the high Tatras were happy until the very second the ground broke. That happiness was real. The beauty they saw was real. We shouldn't let the ending define the entire journey. We should hold on to the light even when we talk about the heavy weight of the dark. The clock on the wall is ticking toward 3 a.m. now. The world outside is asleep, and the silence is deep and heavy. It is the perfect time to let the tension go. These stories are finished for tonight, and their weight doesn't have to be yours to carry into tomorrow. You can leave them here in this room by the fire. You can drift off knowing that you have looked into the vanishing point and come back out on the other side. That is a kind of strength. I truly appreciate you spending this time with me. Storytelling is a way of building a bridge between us, even when we are alone in our own rooms. It is a way of saying that we are part of the same human narrative, facing the same mysteries and the same shadows. If you feel a connection to these cases, I would love for you to leave a comment about which one stayed with you the most. It helps me know that someone is out there on the other side of the radio tonight. Before you close your eyes, take one last look at your surroundings. Appreciate the solid floor beneath your feet and the warmth of your blankets. These are the things that the travelers in the Salar and the climbers on Everest would have given everything for. They are small things, but they are the most important things. We are lucky to have them. We are lucky to be here listening to the rain and sharing a bit of the night before the sun comes up to start the day. I will be here again soon with more stories from the dark corners of our history. There are still so many voices that haven't been heard and so many mysteries that haven't been solved. But for now, it is time to rest. The rain is slowing down and the fire is just a bed of glowing coals. The world is waiting for the morning, and you should be ready for it. Sleep well, and remember to keep the light on in your mind, even when the lights in the house are finally turned off. It is a strange thing, isn't it, how a simple year like 1998 can hold so much life and so much loss. We look back at these dates, and they seem like a long time ago, but for the families of the victims, it is as if it happened yesterday. Time doesn't heal everything, but it does give us the distance to see the patterns. It gives us the chance to look back and say that we will do better, that we will watch the horizon and check the locks on our doors. I am going to sit here for a while longer and just listen to the silence. It is a good silence, the kind that follows a long conversation with a friend. I hope you feel that way too. Like we have navigated the storm and found the harbor. The vanishing point is still out there, but tonight we are right where we need to be. We are present, we are aware, and we are together in the quiet. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough for anyone in this world. Just one last thing before I go. If you found these stories valuable, please share them with someone else who might be sitting alone tonight. Word of mouth is how these memories stay alive. It is how the angel of the meadow gets her name back, and how the jewel flight remains a lesson for the future. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one, but for now, it is time to say goodnight. Stay safe out there.